Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter was a mortal wizard in Lord of the Rings verse? Before we start, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original story's link in the descriptions. Please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. It wasn't cold nor terribly hot out. He had heard earlier that morning the weather report muffled through the door of his cupboard. 20 degrees Celsius with a slight wind, but that was to be expected in the first week of August. Outside the weather was what most would consider perfect, though it did little to improve his current living quarters. The cupboard rarely reflected the weather outside. It was always dusty, always stuffy, and normally fairly warm. Today it was darker than normal, as for his uncle had seen fit to not only lock him in, but to also ensure every crack was stuffed to not allow any light in, and he had taken the bulb out from the single light fixture to ensure Harry couldn't turn it on. "Please, uncle. Please," a small sob escaped him which he held his mouth tight shut. Crying wasn't allowed. He shifted again, straining his eyes to where he knew the door lay, wishing, hoping beyond hope that he could chance some light. It was the darkness that his uncle was sure he was bathed in, that made him feel as though he could not breathe, could not think. He had been locked in the cupboard for longer than normal, and it had slowly ate at him, until he was pushed beyond the point of restraint. The stampede of steps alerted the boy as the man stormed from the kitchen where he had been reading his papers over some afternoon tea, over to where he locked his nephew away. The large man wrenched the door open and grasped his meaty hand around the scrawny boy. Large green eyes shining with unshed tears pleaded up at him, and he threw the boy down hissing, "What did I say about crying?" Breathing deeply, so as to try and control his sobs, he stammered, "Freaks like me don't get to cry. I am sorry, so sorry, Uncle Vernon. I hate the dark, and I have been in my room since Friday. I know I was bad. I will never ever do it again. I'll be normal. I promise, please." Harry huddled on the floor at the raise of his uncle's hand, staring at where he thought his uncle's feet were. It was so bright, it having been midday and light was pouring through all the windows. There was going to be a lot of yelling, and he most likely would be hit a few times, but he couldn't help but feel a weight lift from him as he was allowed out of the darkness. His uncle went from red to purple, and the boy shrunk. He knew he had been asking a lot from the man who constantly reminded him that he had been taken in out of charity since his good-for-nothing parents died in a car crash. But the darkness in the small cupboard had been suffocating, to say the least, and he yearned for the sunlight. But ever since Thursday at school he had been promised an extended punishment for his freakishness. He honestly had not meant to jump so high, for how else did he make it to the top of the school while Dudley and his gang chased him? Dudley had loudly claimed later on that Harry had been saying spells and casting magic, to which Harry pleaded with his aunt and uncle that he knew magic was not real, and he knew things like that were not allowed in the Dursleys. Though it had been only a week before he had been caught reading The Lost Years of Merlin by his Aunt Petunia, and he felt as though he were still being punished for that. Now it was Sunday. He had gone straight into the cupboard after school Friday, and had not been allowed out until now. His aunt had left with Dudley to go shopping, and his uncle had opted to stay home and get some of his paperwork done before having to return to work the next day. Harry had been trying really hard not to cry, but the thought of his cousin, whom only a little while ago had been allowed to go out and be free to go outside, he couldn't help but pity himself. "I am sorry," he attempted to say more but was cut short as his uncle cuffed him over the head hard. He hit the wall and whimpered, going tightly into a ball. His uncle rarely hit him anywhere that could be seen by the school or neighbors, only when he was really upset. Harry shivered as sensed the fat man attempting to control his rage, but it seemed to be impossible, as for the boy's tears were now flowing freely down his face. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." The man grabbed the boy and punched him in the side several times before throwing him to the door. Harry wasn't sure how it happened, just that he knew that he was going to be beaten and was frightened. It was rare his uncle came up to the point of rage beyond a smack or two, sometimes a swift kick to the ribs, but once before he had been beaten so hard he was out of school for the week and had to work hard to conceal the limp afterwards. That had been when he had only been 2 years ago, shortly after his 8th birthday. Memories of that came back, and he just remembered reaching for the door, wishing so deeply, with his whole being, that he could be anywhere. Somehow the door opened, even though it was the opposite way it was supposed to open, and he went flying through. Tumbling, he found himself coughing on dirt and leaves, sputtering. The light was bright to his eyes, so he was unable to see. He was shaking, but he didn't let that stop him from stumbling up to his feet and attempting to run down the road. He stumbled off for a few moments, his sight adjusting enough to make out a tree before collapsing in a fit of tears at the base of it. He held his mouth, trying to sob silently as possible in fear of his uncle finding him. After a few moments, he forced his breath to ev, though that didn't stop him from trembling like a leaf. His eyes fully adjusted, and he was surprised he could see perfectly fine even without his glasses. Blinking his surprise made him forget his tears, or the reason why his face throbbed. It was clear he was nowhere near Privet Drive. He doubted he was even in Little Whinging anymore. Not a house was in sight, no roads or cars. Straining his ears, he didn't hear any noise associated with living in the city, and the air smelled fresh. Looking around, he also noticed autumn leaves had fallen and a crisp breeze caused him to shiver in both fear and cold, not the cooling warmth of the late summer chill he had been expecting. "Where am I?" he murmured to himself, all too used to one-sided conversation. He pushed off the tree gently and called out, Hello. Anyone there?" He glanced side to side and shivered, rubbing his arms. It had been summer only moments before, so he was only wearing a baggy t-shirt and khaki shorts that had fit almost like pants since they used to belong to Dudley were now in a pool about his feet. His belt must have came loose, he concluded, so overcome with all that was happening he missed that, even though the shirt had normally be a bit large on him, it now fit him like a dress. He also was barefoot considering he had been inside. Taking a step, he stumbled and blinked. Something about his movement had signaled to him something was off. Or perhaps it was how close to the ground he was. Despite the fact he was 10. Though never tall, he knew he should have been farther up. Looking down, he saw his legs had become short stumps, as were his arms. Closing his eyes, he forced his breathing to be steady as his mind raced. He ran a hand through what was now long glossy hair and felt a whimper come to him, though he beat it down. No crying. He was not going to panic, that would solve nothing. Obviously something happened, something out of this world. His imagination soared that magic could perhaps truly be real, that somehow he had magicked himself away, that all those years of dreaming and wishing were not in vain. Looking around, he called out again, not missing now how his voice was small and soft, not quite the same but not so different than it had been a moment before. "Is anybody there?" Seeing as how no one was going to answer him, he began walking, though he found that he suddenly became even more clumsy than usual, starting back the way he thought he came from, hoping that he would somehow cross some threshold and return home to his uncle, pondering. If magic were real, and he had suddenly transported himself away, why was alone? And why did he look and feel like, what a toddler? What was Uncle Vernon going to say? He suddenly tripped over the long T and sniffled, trying to keep his sobs under control, and stayed on his hands and knees, blurry vision looking at nothing in particular as he took deep steadying breaths. Did he even want to return to Uncle Vernon, if he was able to return to Privet Drive? That was. Biting his lip in a nervous manner, he glanced about. It seemed to him, even if he did, he was nowhere close to home. He hugged himself harder, walking the grassy plain, and somehow he knew he would not go back. At least not yet. No, he would stay here, wherever here was, because deep down he knew he was meant to be here. But he didn't care much, despite the feeling of guilt twisted in his stomach at remembering that his uncle and aunt had at least been generous enough to feed, clothe, and house him when they had only wished for one child, Dudley, and had only taken him in out of kindness. He pushed the voice at the back of his head that tried to reason that there was no kindness in his relative's actions. Harry walked looking about the plain lands. There was the occasional trees here and there, but besides that it was mostly just grass, rock and earth. This made it easier to see farther distances, mountains one way where not far off. Looking opposite, he saw far off what could be a forest. To his left he saw nothing but plain, and Harry was presently surprised to see smoke in the distance off to his right. He paused before turning his stride that way, ignoring the pain in his feet when he stepped on some sharp rocks. There was someone over there. He didn't know what he would say, or how he would explain that he had somehow appeared outside of his home, in a body that felt that it was his own. Harry didn't even give these things a second thought. The knowledge he wasn't going to be alone to fend for himself in the unknown wild was sufficient. Not knowing who he would encounter, he trekked on, picking up the pace to find who he hoped to be friends at the smoke. Chapter 2, Wishing for Sunny Skies. Chapter 2. By the time Harry made it relatively close to where what seemed to be a small group of loud men chattering about a fire, laughing and shoving each other good naturally. The sun had fully set and he was shivering fiercely, the moon giving him enough light so he could see that his breath came out in puffs. Stumbling over, he slowed as he neared the camp. The men were all short, all with well-grown-out beards, and pointed hats. There were 3 that stayed awake near the fire as the rest retired off to cots. 2 darker-haired ones were currently laughing loudly, clapping each other on the back as the one with white hair sat across from him, their amusement seemingly at his expense. Worrying on his lower lip, Harry wondered if he should approach them. They seemed like nice men, if not dressed oddly in their chainmail and medieval-looking garb, and he hoped they were in the mood to take in a strange boy. Though he eyed the sword and axes lying near the men, he didn't feel too keen on surprising them. He stood there for a while, unsure of what to do. It was dark enough they didn't see him. Thankfully clouds had swept up the half-moon filtering its light, and he was close enough that he could give a slight holler and catch their attention. "They're the only ones that are around." Another shiver ran down his spine as he held himself tighter. "I may die without help." Fear of death lurked around him, as if it was his dark cupboard back at home calling for him, and he decided to draw their attention by calling out. He opened his mouth, only to snap it shut again as a piercing blue gaze drew his general direction by the one with a white beard. Harry held his breath, as the other squinted, as if willing the darkness to give way what it hid. He had noticed the white-bearded dwarf gazing into the distance, seeming to survey the land, not caring about the lack of light given. Harry had not expected him to focus his gaze in his direction, and he was sure he had been discovered. The man frowned, wrinkles appearing on his large nose as if he was smelling something foul. Grabbing the sword by his side, he stood heading in Harry's direction, silencing the others. The white-haired dwarf was slowly followed by the other 2 as they advanced with their axes, one quietly asking a question to the elder of the trio in a deep guttural language that Harry had never heard before. "I thought I saw something shift in the darkness," murmured the snow-haired one in English, though his accent was strange and Harry was sure he had never heard anything like it from England. The white-bearded one's eyes squinted, seeming to peer right through the blackness to Harry, who stood hard-hammering. After a moment of the 3 standing in tense silence circling the camp at the edge of where the light flickered from the flickering of the fire, they slowly made their way back, shoulders tense and eyes alert. They didn't lay their weapons down again once they sat, and Harry doubted they would. Shaking, he began to back up. There must be others than these oddly short men, others whom were more pleasant in both appearance and manner. He turned and began to silently make his way to where he had spied a wood, his eyes barely making out shapes, and he was thankful when the cloud cover released the light from the moon again. "Where am I?" He mulled over everything that had happened to try and calm himself and keep control over his situation, shivering as he pulled the large shirt around him tighter, willing it to keep some heat into his bony frame. "How did I get here? Could it be that magic is real?" Harry glanced around him fearfully, as if his uncle would jump out and beat him for thinking such a thing. "It must be. It has to be. Here is no logical explanation otherwise." Despite his current situation, Harry couldn't help but smile a bit, knowing all those times when things had happened around him and he had wished it to be magic were not his imagination. "Maybe there is someone out there for me." He couldn't finish that thought as painful memories of his aunt and uncle telling him how worthless he was, how no one would want to bother like him, and how he should be grateful for their acts of charity by giving him food, a roof over his head, and Dudley's old things. "When I had heard my sister and her terrible husband died and you were alive," his aunt was telling him as she roughly scrubbed at his face. He had been pushed by Dudley into a mud puddle, and his aunt had been furious when seeing him track mud into the house. "I knew we had to take you in. No one else would want you." So, she scrubbed harder before gripping his arm painfully with her bony hands and forced him to look her in the eye. "You better remember that next time you decide to play in the mud." He shivered, forcing the memory out of his mind, willing himself to be in the present. Harry had made it closer to the woods, his hands so cold he had trouble unclenching them from their curled form under his arms, and his tiny feet were numb and he was sure covered in blood and dirt. He looked up, thinking how nice it would be to sleep in one of the tall trees, when a howl sounded off, causing the boy to shake then more from just the wind. It had come from the woods and was soon followed by others. Frightened, Harry began to back away, catching glinting golden eyes appearing between the branches. Turning, he looked to where the camp lay. It was far enough that he could tell he would have to sprint for at least 5 minutes to reach it. The men that had originally been awake were now rousing the rest of their party as they all began grabbing weapons and lighting torches to better see their enemy. It was lucky for Harry the moon chose that moment to press out of the clouds and bathe the field with its silvery light. Gathering up his courage and forcing himself not to look behind his shoulder to scream at what was coming to him, he looked to the camp and let a shaky breath out. He began to dash towards the camp. At the same time, a feeling of something jumping out of the woods and swipe at him came. He gave a startled yelp, pressing on harder as he felt his pursuers closing in on him much too fast. Hot breath was on his heels and he looked desperately to where he saw several of the men pointing his way and shouting, though he didn't understand the guttural language they spoke in. "I'm not going to make it," he thought frantically as he ran to the group, shouting as a claw swiped at him causing him to stumble. "I'm not going to make it." As if hearing his thoughts, a claw hooked into the back of his leg causing a cry of pain to burst from his lips. This was more painful than any beating his uncle had given him, and he didn't even care about the tears that burst unchecked as the words of how ungrateful Harry always was and how he could be going through so much more rang through his head. Uncle Vernon was right, thought Harry as he rolled to the side, missing sharp teeth only by inches, tears streaming down his face as he pathetically sobbed trying to escape what seemed to be a very large wolf. He was right. "I want to go back home." He silently begged for forgiveness from his large uncle, the man he had always wanted to push down a flight of stairs before leaving to a good home. He was on his back and another wolf jumped at him, mouth gaping wide, intending to take a good chunk out of him. But just as soon as the thought crossed Harry's mind that he was about to die, an arrow lodged deeply into the beast's golden eye, causing it to fly to the side with a yelp. The bearded men were now battling the large wolves, some of which were rode by horrible-looking creatures that couldn't be anything close to human beings. Large green eyes frantically shot from one fighting man to another before Harry forced himself to flip to his hands and knees, despite the pain that shot through his leg, and began crawling to the fire away from the battle, gasping as one of the great wolves fell in front of him. Giving off a shriek, he backed away as its rider wriggled out from underneath it, snarling angrily. It was tall with gangling arms and legs, ears pointed, though the left looked as if it had been bitten half off. Piercings went across its brow, its eyes red alight with the need for blood. At Harry's scream, he turned them hungrily to him. "Elf child," it squealed, voice high with delight as it crouched bouncing in place. "Oh, I haven't seen one o' them never. Bet it's tasty." There was drool dripping down from that grubby gnarled chin, though that didn't matter to the monster. And no, Harry suddenly felt himself snatched from behind by a large hand that was able to engulf his entire upper arm with no effort, and Harry found himself looking into one of darker-haired men's snarling faces. Such a coward to attack such a weak creature. His voice carried disgust even though he had now set a protective arm over Harry's shoulder. "How about trying me on for size?" The creature laughed, spittle shining in the moonlight as it sprayed from his mouth. "What is this? A dwarf protecting an elf? I never thought I would see the day." "Enough talking. Where is the fight in ye?" shouted the man, and Harry could do no more than dart wide emerald eyes from the man to the creature. Suddenly the man or dwarf, from what he had gathered, lunged, two axes that Harry had failed to notice before brought swinging with him. Harry watched, stunned, as the man dodged a thrust from the foul creature's sword, used one axe to hook behind the creature to pull him in before swinging the other down on the juncture between the monster's shoulder and neck, causing black blood to spray onto the man's face. Grunting, he dislodged the now choking creature, who was slowly drowning in its own blood, and looked back to Harry. Harry hadn't moved, his unblinking gaze unable to pull away from the sight of the gaping wound, the creature's eyes wide as it lived the last few minutes of its life staring his way, though it seemed to be straight through him. He was trembling now like a leaf, though both fear and cold had been forgotten. His mind was unable to come up with a rational explanation to the day's events and the battle that was slowing around him as the last of the wolves and creatures made their way back to the dense wood, the rest of the men around him making quick work of those left. The man with the two axes had an unreadable expression on his scruffy face came over, and Harry found it much easier to think about the way the man-dwarf, he corrected himself, looked so odd rather than the death of some kind of unknown creature in an unknown land. He wasn't very tall, none of the dwarves were, Harry noted, with a black beard that reached to his belted waist, a few braids strewn about it. His brows were bushy, and nose was a bit large, eyes a deep brown, but despite his harsh looks Harry sensed kindness. He knelt down to where Harry was standing. Harry only came to his waistline in his new shorter form and placed a strong hand on Harry's tiny shoulder. "What are you doing in these parts, young one?" His voice was deep and the accent as strange as the others. Was it some form of Welsh? Aye. He blinked back tears, urging them not to fall, and sniffled. I don't know. I was at home, with my Uncle Vernon. Then. I don't know what happened, he finished lamely, wishing he could remember what to do in an emergency situation. What was the first step? Find an adult, like a police officer. Well, he did that, though he doubted there was any type of law enforcement around. Swallowing, he remembered his uncle's harsh reminder not to cry, and he willed the tears back, only one rolling down his cheek unchecked. After a moment of silence, the man seeming to ponder what he said as a few of the others started to gather around them, causing Harry to shuffle nervously, disliking the stares, he nodded. Well, that is odd, he began slowly. Where is your uncle's home? Is it Mirkwood? The word was said with slight hostility, and Harry flinched back. No, he attempted to sound confident, but his voice wavered. I have never heard of Mirkwood. I think I am very, very far from home. His lip quivered and he took a shuddering breath. I was at my home, number 4 Privet Drive. It's in Little Winging. He looked hopeful to the company that had been watching the interaction with interest, and looked desperately back to the man who shook his head, reflecting the answer of those around him. I am sorry, Elfing. I have never heard of a place such as that. His frown deepened even more. Is that from the west? I am not familiar with those lands. Feeling a bit desperate, Harry pressed on. It's in England. Surely you know of England? I do not know what direction it is from here, but... At the confused looks, Harry felt his stomach sink and black spots appeared in his vision. We do not know of this England, spoke a kind, old voice full of authority, and Harry looked up to the white-haired dwarf who had first spotted him in the dark. But we needn't an elf child in our company. He hummed and scratched his long white beard and looked the child up and down quickly before continuing. But we can speak of this later. Come. Kindness softened his gaze, and a slight upturn of his lips made his face suddenly seem less hostile, and Harry limped over, desperately hoping for the kindness directed at him. Let us patch you up and come sit by the fire. We can continue to discuss this. They made their way to the fire. The first dwarf with the 2 axes, having latched them to his belt, picked him up, gruffly commenting that he needn't walk with an injury. Of the group, the 2 who had been speaking to him set to work patching up his leg and finding him some warm blankets that were thick hides of animals as the rest of the camp began settling down, building the fire up to a roar, and a few seemed to take watch. They were on edge, and Harry didn't blame him. He leaned heavily onto the dwarf with 2 axes, named Floy, and a large hand rested on his shoulder. You are tired, and rightly so, young one. Rest. We will discuss how to get you home in the morning. Harry didn't need to really be told this, as for his eyes had slid shut and his worried heart calmed slightly at the deep soothing voices of the men around him singing in the same language he hadn't understood before. It was beautiful, if not rough and slightly haunting, and it didn't take long for Harry to be lulled into a deep slumber while in Floy's arms. Floy looked up with dark eyes to Balin, who had been silently wondering what to do with the elf boy, and what to make of his strange story. But there was something else in those eyes. An angered look as he tucked a blanket about the small frame. How could the elves allow one so young from their sight? Floy finally asked what had been on all their minds. It was no secret how much the elves treasured their young, as for it was not often they had children. This one was odd, with jet black hair and enchanting large green eyes, small and skinny even for an elf. Such a young one should not be exposed to such horrors. Perhaps he was being sentimental because saw his own dark-haired son a bit too much when looking to the elf, though the only similarities they shared being the same shade of black hair and youth. Balin hummed, as he had been much that night before, brushing the child's brow, eyes narrowing. This child has seen more than his fair share of angry hands. His statement caused not only Floy but also some of the nearer dwarves to tense. What makes you think that, Balin? Asked a dwarf Nori whose hair was gold melding into a silver with age. He had finished tending to the fire but had been too uneasy to lay down and rest along with the others in their company. Already their journey had been riddled with danger, and this was icing on the cake. A strange abandoned elf child, alone in the wilds. The way the child holds himself, his reactions and voice. Balin shook his head, having seen children who had went without love before, and this scar. Something about it speaks of a dark past. Balin brushed the hair back to show the ugly jagged mark. The company frowned, obviously distressed by the information. No child, of any race, should have to undergo such a lifestyle. It was understood that some may feel the dwarves tough on their own at times, teaching them the way of fighting early on and bringing them down to mine young, but that was not without love. Men were known to put their children to work young, also, but there was a clear difference in having your child help with a family business, and creating fear and pain in their lives. What are we going to do with the boy? Frár voiced what they were all wondering. Floy subconsciously held the boy closer. We certainly cannot take him with us. The road is far too dangerous for a child. It has taken us far too long avoiding that accursed Mirkwood to return to Erebor. We have almost reached the river crossing. There is no turning back now, someone said, and there were murmurs of agreement. Another voice growled, and we all know the Grand King of Mirkwood would never allow us to return to our quest once in his lands. He would not approve of us going to get the Ring of Power. A chorus of agreement swept through the party, and Balin looked troubled. We certainly cannot take him to Mirkwood, can we? Balin murmured, as if more to himself than the party. Ori, who had come to sit by his brother, shook his head. After our last encounter, I highly doubt they would invite us over for supper. There was a bellow of laughter from the group, accounting the tale of how Thorin and company had escaped from Mirkwood on the group's way to the Lonely Mountain. Something seemed to dawn on Balin, and he continued, but the king was quite hospitable, and willing to negotiate. We have nothing the king would want. Ori scoffed, remembering that they indeed no longer held the precious gems that the king of Mirkwood treasured so. Balin nodded. This is true. It is 2 days' time till the edge of Mirkwood. We will have to hope the kindness of the king enough to allow our release. There is nothing we have over him. There was some grumbling among the group, but after some banter there were no better ideas. What to do with an elf child in the middle of the wilds on the way to the mines of Moria? Then it is decided. Balin spoke finally as the argument died into a chorus of agreeing grumbles. Come dawn we leave for Mirkwood. Upon the edge of the forest we will set up camp, and I will bring the child in to the king. Should I not return within 2 days' time, continue on without me. There was a silence that followed, finally broken by Ori. We have one thing that the king of Mirkwood would want. We have one thing we can use to negotiate with. He looked down to the child sleeping fitfully, as if his mind was filled with shadows that were out to get him. You can not seriously mean we use a child as a bargaining chip? Growled Floy, a glint entering his eye that warned the other dwarf his next words should be chosen with care. Gaze still unwavering, he continued, it is as we said. King Thranduil will never see it well that we return to Moria for the Ring of Power. So I propose we send a messenger in to notify the elves of the child, and have them come and collect the child with a small group. They will dare not follow us lest have a battle on the plains, and they will be at a disadvantage with our numbers. Some voiced agreement and others displeasure at his proposal. Their voices echoed through the group, and Balin seemed to be weighing this. Frowning and looking down to the delicate child in his arms, Floy growled, how do we know that he will not come to any harm from the elves? If it is as you said, Balin, then he hasn't been in good hands. But he hasn't been in Mirkwood either, countered Ori. It is as if he isn't even from these lands. And who better to help him than his own people? There truly is no other option. Floy looked between Ori and Balin, but to hold him as a mere tool of trade, I think it better we bring him into Mirkwood. The king isn't heartless, and our brothers in Erebor would seek to avenge us had he not allowed us to return on our quest. We needn't tell him why we wish to reclaim those halls. He will not question it, as for they are ours to reclaim. No, Floy, Balin finally spoke, though he did it heavily as if he was still choosing his words. I believe that we need to put some more thought to it than that. The king of Mirkwood is no fool. He will suspect something such as the ring has come into play. Though, at Floy's obvious displeasure, I am not sure I agree with you either, Ori. Do we wish to use the boy as a bargaining chip? That makes us come off more hostile than we intend for it to, which to the elves would never be overlooked. The group became silent once again, and Balin continued, we have 2 days until Mirkwood. We have until then to decide. It was as if that was the end of the discussion as the group moved away. Either way, they would be rid of the elf boy in Mirkwood. They just hoped it didn't come as any more of a hindrance that it already had. Chapter 3 Wishing for sunny skies. The sun creeped over the horizon, brightening the sky, bringing sight to the land. Floy could see the remains of the battle from the night before in the distance, along with the snoring company of dwarves around him. He had not slept well that night, the elf child tossing and turning accompanied with slight whimpers haunting him through the night. He had stroked the boy's hair, singing lowly dwarfish lullabies, though he wondered how comforting they were compared to the elf's own. For a while now the boy lay still, curled into an impossibly small ball up against Floy. He had stopped his light cries, and slept almost peacefully except the frown marring the impeccably perfect features. You already seem quite fond of the boy. Floy glanced up to Balin, who had came up behind him looking as if he too hadn't slept well that night. He reminds me of my son, Floy simply stated, and stopped himself from stroking a stray hair from the child's head. Balin nodded, as if he could have guessed, sitting down, pipe clenched between his teeth. Floy looked down to the elf, truly amazed that he was seeing one of the ancient beings so young. Elves always were aloof, emotionless, distant, and walked around with their noses in the air as if they only saw the dwarves as mere scum, as if the other races were not even worth their breath. But this child had no such demeanor. Despite him having been awake for only a short while in their presence that night, he had shown emotions like any other race Floy knew, and looked to them all with unwavering, even modestly downcast eyes. Floy remembered what Balin said. He had spoke to him later that night, murmuring about bruises on the child's back, as if he had been beaten over a period of time. The thought of such pain being done to one so young was unfathomable, and Floy couldn't bring himself to give the child back to the elves, in case he were just to be returned into ill hands. And it was just as he was about to voice his opinion when Balin spoke. I know what you are thinking, Floy, and I too have been hesitant about this exchange. Closing his mouth, Floy relaxed slightly as Balin settled back, tucking his pipe away, and decided to listen to what the white-haired dwarf had to say. I have thought of it and decided that I must bring the boy to a friend of mine. Before Floy could say anything, Balin held a hand up and continued sternly, it needs to be done. I will part from the group, though, so as to not hinder our journey. I shall bring him to my friend, who is well acquainted to the elves of Rivendell and left a far better impression than any dwarf ever has. Floy looked down to the child, who turned lightly, frown still pulling at his lips as he slept, but he is so young. It will be difficult to travel with a child, by your own no less. If you are attacked, it would be highly unlikely you would live. Don't you fret, Balin said, leaning forward. I have a sharp eye, and an even sharper blade. I have not dulled in my years, and am able to hold my own. Besides, I know a short cut through the mountains south where I will go to Dunland and get a pony to hasten our journey. What path through the mountains could possibly be safe enough to bring a child? Floy was truly perplexed with Balin's cryptic response and gestured to the direction the mountains lay, trying his best to keep the boy from waking, though failing to not gain the attention of their company. They are riddled with foul beasts, and even the most skilled have been known to disappear without a trace. Balin glanced to the others, who had slowed in their morning packing, the camp slowly coming alive with about half the party now up and the other half grumbling and groaning, attempting to wake, before standing and saying in a louder voice, I shall take the boy to the hobbits of the Shire. There you will be left in what I know will be good hands. His explanation was met with expected hostility, the majority yelling and shouting, of course waking Harry with a frightened gasp. Floy settled a comforting hand on the trembling boy as he breathed in deep shaky breaths, shooting the dwarves a wide green-eyed gaze. It is all right, Floy murmured, they are easily upset and bicker like children, but they really mean no harm. The child nodded, slowly sliding out from under his hand as if hoping to not bring offense to the other but too uncomfortable to allow it to stay. He shifted in the furs the dwarves had covered him with and hugged them closer with the cool autumn breeze reminding them that winter was coming. The large shirt under him slid past his knees and didn't fit on both shoulders, giving little warmth, and the animal skins were plenty warm if not a bit scratchy. Well then, Ori pipped up with his arms crossed where he stood in the group, I would say arguing about it isn't going to solve anything. Balin is right. This child is not a chip to be traded about, and Mirkwood is far too dangerous to chance being captured by the king. The group had silenced and seemed to have separated so that Ori stood opposite and alone from Balin, Floy, and Harry. Balin nodded, it will only set me back a wee bit. I will be able to rejoin you in about a month's time if allowed to take a pony. More than that if I must travel to Dunland first to buy one. There were grumbles from the group, and they were obviously not convinced. Look, Floy stood sliding Harry off his lap, deciding to agree with Balin's reasoning, we have very few choices. We cannot possibly return to Erebor, much less with an elf child. The elves are going to want to know where he is, and it would not do well for our kind to have an elf in dwarf hands when they find him. Oin stood and walked between Balin and his brother, glancing to both before crossing his arms. We shall give you one pony. He gave a stern look to the company to silence any disagreement. Bring him to the Shire, as for I am sure it is our Bilbo to which you bring him. We shall meet you in the halls of Moria, where we will follow you." He turned from the three to the group and raised his head. "Balin has never led us astray. I listened to his wisdom on the quest to defeat Smaug the Terrible, and many times more, and I will listen to him now. He is our leader, and knows best. Until then I will lead you to the mines, unless someone disagrees." No one spoke up but chose to shuffle about grumbling, some kicking the dirt. "Then it's settled," Balin said. "The boy and I shall separate and go to the Shire. I will meet you in a month's time in Moria." "And I shall join you," Floy spoke from behind Harry, who had been silently watching the whole exchange, unsure of what to say. Balin looked to him for a moment but didn't argue, just gave a firm nod and turned to Ori. The group continued to pack and ready as they had before, and Balin went to choose a pony, discussing matters to Ori while Floy crouched down next to the emerald-eyed child. "We have not gave you much say in any of this," he murmured, and Harry looked up to him wide-eyed. "I would hope this is all right for you. I hear that hobbits are a kind and gentle folk, and Bilbo is friends of your kind." "My kind?" The boy's voice rung like a small bell, and wasn't unpleasant to hear. He nodded slowly, watching the child, who seeded an equal mixture of confusion and curiosity into his large eyes. "Yes. He is friends with the elves of Rivendell. Do you know of Rivendell?" Harry silently shook his head, truly at a loss for words. His kind? He wasn't sure how to take that. Perhaps he meant human, but the group continued to mention elves. He wondered if they wrongly thought him an elf, and then that thought was washed away with the exciting thought of meeting elves. Floy had smiled a bit and stood at Harry's silence, and turned to Ori, who was approaching them with his arms full. Ori had always been a bit awkward, though after having witnessed the passing of Thorin and his nephews he had grown. Now years later he stood tall and strong, ready to lead. He had been one of the first to volunteer to leave the wealth and wonder of the Lonely Mountain. It was unsaid, but Floy knew it to be the pain of living where Philly and Keely once stood, where they should be ruling in the flourishing kingdom. His kindness never left him, which showed in what he held in his arms. "They are not that great," he shrugged, giving the child a small smile, "but I made ye some clothes and shoes. There was once a time I was a shoemaker, you know, so they are not as poorly done as the garb." Harry's mouth went into an O shape as he slowly accepted them, gazing up at Ori with unblinking eyes. Looking down, he saw the shoes were indeed of great make, looking as if they would reach just above his ankle, and were made with dark furs with a lighter brown fur puffed around the top. They were laced, and Harry spied a few designs on the side that added to the beauty. The cloths were simple enough. A simple long-sleeved tunic with leggings that were both a light brown, and a cape with hood that was dark brown that looked just a tad large, but Harry didn't care. You made these for me?" he breathed, running his finger along the design on the boot's side, seeing how it looked like diamonds and other strange etchings. Ori shrugged. "Spare project I had already been needling away at, close enough to what your feet seem to be sized for. Perhaps with some room for growing. I know it is probably nothing as grand as any elf could make, but yeah, me and the boys put it together for you. Wouldn't want you to freeze with the—" Before Ori could finish, Harry had launched himself around his waist, though maybe not as gracefully as one would expect of an elf, probably due to the limp he had from the wound on his leg. After a squeeze, Harry blushed and looked down. "Thank you very much. They're beautiful and I love them." "You're welcome," Ori said, truly surprised at the affectation display, never imagining an elf, even a child, was capable of such emotion. Harry bit his lip, not wanting to seem too babyish. A memory of Vernon scolding him for acting like a baby when he expressed gratitude towards a teacher in a similar way, and flinched when he reminded himself he was 10 and was too old to be acting in such a way despite his newer, slightly shorter stature. Trying to pull if he hadn't just acted very childish, shrugged. "Well, I'll get dressed then." While Harry dressed, Balin returned and turned to Floy, who was packing up his bedding. "You sure you want to do this?" Floy paused before nodding and whispering in a hoarse voice, "I know that if someone found my boy in a similar situation, I would hope they would do all possible to return him to safety." Balin didn't say anything, just nodded with a frown and paused as if to say something before turning back to the pony he had chosen and fastened the last of their things on its side. Harry trotted back, attempting to keep his limp hidden, and the dwarves turned to see him in the brown leather pants, tunic, and the slightly large cloak that went just to his heels. "Well, I am glad to see they fit." Ori was smiling, and Harry returned the smile. "Thank you again. They are wonderful." He shyly downcast his eyes, twisting at the cape's fabric. "No one has ever made me cloths before." The dwarves' smiles strained on their faces as they took the meaning of those words with far more understanding and worry than the boy probably knew. "Well, my boy," Balin said, walking over, and Harry looked up to him, "we best be off. I know you haven't had much say in all of this, but I have never heard of your homeland of England." Harry murmured, nibbling his lip. "I live in London, England, little whining Surrey, with my Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and my cousin Dudley." His voice faltered slightly and his shoulders drooped at the thought of his only family. Floy knelt down next to him. "And you miss your family, do you? Do you wish to return?" Harry bit his lip, twisting the fabric in his hands. "Well, they're the only family that I have." It was slightly ground-shaking to hear Floy voice the question that had been on the back of his mind since the day before. That, along with all that had happened, and his head was practically spinning. Did he want to return? Floy looked to the boy, who shuffled nervously, and he smiled sadly, ruffling his hair. "Well, Balin is right, we best be off. Want to get a start before sunset." And he stood and headed over to the group. Harry stretched his leg a bit, but stopped short, feeling the wound begin to open, and gingerly walked over to Balin, who had gestured for him to come over and let the dwarf help hoist him onto the pony. Though Harry had always been nimble and light on his feet, so he was sure he would have been able to do it himself, but accepted the help nonetheless, not wanting to aggravate his wound any more. "So you are bringing me to see elves?" he murmured to the snow-haired dwarf as the other made sure his feet were in the stirrups correctly. Balin glanced up. "No, I am bringing you to a good friend of mine who is a hobbit." "I've never heard of a hobbit before," Harry said as he watched the dwarves patting Floy on the shoulders and saying parting words. "Though of course where I come from there are no such thing as dwarves or elves either." Balin's eyebrows furrowed together as the troop of dwarves departed the small area and Floy returned to them. "No such thing? Why, lad, you yourself are an elf, so there must be." "I'm a what?" Harry looked to him, trying to keep his tightly clenched fists unnoticed as he felt a shock of hope. Those days of laying in his cupboard, wishing and dreaming of something more to the world, something more to him, came back, making his heart almost stop with anticipation. "Why," Floy grunted, having heard the conversation, "you are an elf, of course. Don't you live with elves such as yourself? I hear they cherish their children." Harry slowly shook his head, though his excitement was only momentary. "Oh well, maybe they didn't want me. My aunt and uncle and cousin are most certainly not elves." He scrunched his nose, thinking of them against all the stories that held elves. "They were nowhere near. No. If they were elves, that would ruin what little fantasy he had delved into, and he wouldn't have that." The two dwarves looked to each other as the boy plucked at nothing in particular on the saddle. This was by far the oddest event they had either encountered. A very young elf boy, who didn't know he was an elf, traveling Middle-earth alone without the protection of the very kind that he belonged to. Who had come from some mysterious country that none had heard of, and having lived with humans. It was unheard of. "Well, when we bring you to Bilbo," Balin said, "he will know what to do. I assume he will wish to bring you to Rivendell, where they are not that bad. I stayed there once." "Will I see you there too?" Harry looked with large unwavering eyes to them. "You have been so kind to me. I could never repay you." Floy got the pony trotting and shook his head. "We have a quest we must return to. Perhaps one day when you are older you shall visit our mines." "You have a mine?" The two dwarves looked to the boy as they walked at a fast pace next to the pony. "That sounds amazing." Both dwarves were slightly amused and taken aback. No elf had ever shown interest in the mines of dwarves before. "You are one elf that I could find myself enjoying the company of," Floy laughed heartily. Harry cocked his head, slightly confused, but nodded slowly and looked forward to the wide stretch of land they traveled, Balin pointing out a tree line that was a mere dot on the horizon. "We should arrive before nightfall if we are lucky," he said, and Harry nodded. For most of that day there was little talk, Harry unsure of what to say to the two and lost in his own thoughts, and the dwarves focusing on running alongside the pony so as not to lose much time. What conversations they did have were light to begin with, before delving into different types of rock and jewels, of their status and of Erebor. Harry listened hungrily for all the tales they told, and the dwarves were more than happy to boast. After several hours of this they were now quiet, a stern focus on their brows as sweat glistened off of them and the pony's mane. Harry felt bad for having it so easy, but knew not to say anything, for his leg wouldn't allow him to keep the pace. He thought of how he had appeared in this world, of how he had changed physically. It was all so much. He shook his head, trying not to think about it. It was beyond his comprehension, and really he didn't want to mind. This was heaven compared to the Dursleys. What if I died? If I am already dead and this isn't real, he thought, his heart hammering, eyes darting every which way as if the image would fade if he were to think it too much. But would I still have the nightmares if I were dead? Still need to sleep and eat? He thought back to that night, and the nightmares that had troubled him. Whispers in the darkness of his mind, shadows that grew and engulfed him, a whisper and a green light. It was something that was frequent back in his little dark cupboard, and didn't seem to leave in this strange world. Perhaps they were even stronger. Death is something only mere mortals would fear. A hiss echoed in his head, a voice that sounded familiar to Harry, and he jumped, looking around. The two dwarves didn't take notice, as for they had been putting all their energy into traveling and keeping their eyes out for attackers. He waited for the voice to speak again, but it was gone. Harry wondered if he was simply losing his mind. Deciding that this was too much stressful thinking for someone of his age. How many 10-year-olds went through this much change? And if he were losing it, not stressing himself would be the best approach to not going insane. He decided to beginning mentally charting everything they passed. A rock. A lone tree. A pond. Another rock. It went like his for hours. He wondered if this was an even faster method of losing his mind, but continued to do so since it didn't make his head spin. By the time they neared the tree line, the sun was setting, sending smoldering colors of orange and red into the sky. They slowed within a few feet and stopped to catch their breath. Harry wanted to comment how amazing their running had been. He had never seen anyone run for such a long period of time with so few breaks. But he found himself reverting to that shy boy who lived in a cupboard all too easily. The excitement and magic of the world he was in not leaving him, but the reminder of who he was coming back to him. Balin murmured to Floy that he was going to walk the tree line to try and remember the entrance, and the other dwarf nodded, looking alert to their surroundings. After the white-haired dwarf walked a few yards, and the silence had stretched on for several minutes with Harry lost in his own little world, trying to wrap his mind around the events that had came to happen ever since his uncle had thrown him, Floy spoke up. "So you didn't know you were an elf?" Harry slowly shook his head, lightly touching the now pointed ears on his head for the 100th time that day. He wanted to tell the dwarf that they had not been like that before, that he had been taller even though he had still been shorter than everyone in his class, and even his hair had grown out and smoothed down, though stayed its original black in color and kept some of its wild nature about it. "You, my boy," Floy finally said as they set up bedding and tied the pony to a tree, "are by far the most oddest thing I have ever encountered." Harry shrugged, unsure if that was a compliment or not. They set up the camp, and they decided to roll the bedding under some large slanted rocks and set up a fire there. Harry offered his help and made his bed off under where two rocks met, feeling a bit safer in the corner. The sun was set by the time the two dwarves had the fire going well, and a pot over it filled with water Balin had grabbed about a mile back in a large water skin. Harry sat quietly while watching the sky darken, enjoying the stars beginning to show. The two dwarves were not very talkative, and Harry couldn't help but feel a smile touch his lips at the stars, so he hummed lightly, twirling his hair around his fingers. They were like this while the stew Floy was making began to slowly boil. Balin kept an eye sharp to the darkness. Floyd stirred the rabbit and potatoes in the pot, and Harry hummed sweetly in the corner, looking to the stars. He would have continued his little song, which had transformed into some extended variation of "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star," when he stopped suddenly, thinking he saw movement in the shadows near him. He jumped and looked, not noticing he had gathered the attention of the dwarves, before nervously biting his lip and attempting to continue humming, though now it was strained as he was sure he saw something in the shadows. "Are you hungry?" Floy called over, and Harry snapped his gaze to him before nodding slightly and standing awkwardly. He limped over, fiddling with his cloak, looking nervously to the dark. Floy handed him a small carved bowl with a spoon that was larger than any Harry had used, that was carved from wood also. "Here ya go. There is more if you want. You need some meat on them bones. It is important you eat well. We will be on the road for some time, and while there is water near, now, soon we may be pressed to only hard tack and jerky." Thanking him, Harry limped over, his leg having become sore, not to mention his backside having been unused to riding a pony all day and his injured leg having been still for so long. Balin settled down next to him after Floy served a bowl to him and gave a good look to the surrounding trees and rocks before looking down to Harry with a kind smile that brought out the wrinkles around his eyes. "No need to fear the dark, my boy. Even though the mountains and woods normally hold ill company, not many tread near this path. I have traveled here many years, I know it is safe." Harry nodded, slowly sipping at the hot soup, smiling at the taste of fresh potatoes, carrots and rabbit. It was not only the most hearty thing he could ever remembered eating, but also the freshness of the ingredients made the taste pop. He didn't mention the fact that he spent most of his time in a dark, cramped cupboard, or that most the time he tried to close his eyes and pretend that he didn't see a dark, shadowy figure in the cupboard with him. It was normal to fear the darkness. Harry knew he wasn't the only kid who did, but he knew that something followed him in the dark. Something that wouldn't give its name, but allowed him to know of its presence. There was never a person he was comfortable enough to speak with about these matters, and a part of him wished to not acknowledge the presence, as if giving it his attention would give it a physical form and power. Perhaps I am insane, Harry thought, sipping at the soup as Floy sat across from them. Would make sense. No one likes me. I somehow appear in this strange place, and everyone thinks I am an elf. So, Floy cleared his throat and Harry looked to him. I think since we are traveling together we should know your name. I must say I am very curious to hear your story. Harry shuffled, stirring his soup, poking at a potato that floated at the top. He felt Balin glance to him before returning his sight to the surrounding areas. Well, my name is Harry. Harry Potter, he shrugged. There isn't much to me. I am a normal boy, or at least was up until yesterday. I live with my relatives in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever really happens. The two were looking at him strangely, so he shrugged a bit. It's true. That is the oddest name I have heard, Harry Potter. Floyd tried it on his tongue and frowned. It sounds similar to the names of man, but stranger even. And what is a neighborhood? I have never heard the term before, Balin added, and Harry's brows knit. Harry stayed silent, unsure if it were wise to continue speaking about himself, but Floyd pressed on. How old are you, Harry? He said the name again, as if trying to make it work. I am 10 years old. I just had my birthday not too long ago, he said. By your looks I would have guessed at most 4, Floy said after swallowing, but of course you elves do age strangely, so I had assumed you were older. You do not speak or act much like most younger children. Harry swallowed another spoonful, and feeling uneasy about being asked more questions, decided to ask one of his own before Floy could think of something else. So you said you have a mine. Could you tell me about it? I bet it is lovely. In all the books I read back at home, whenever dwarves were mentioned, they were said to have been great miners of gems and precious metals. The two broadened their chests and lifted their heads in obvious pride and began to boast about the beauty of dwarfish architecture, and the superiority of their craft. Harry was instantly absorbed, and soon they began to tell dwarfish stories of great wars, journeys and discoveries. The night went on and Harry found himself dozing off under the animal skins, a smile on his face and the images of mighty halls and glittering gems lulling him to sleep. That night Harry slept more soundly than he ever could remember, dreaming wonderful dreams of going on adventures of his own across the land he had been told was called Middle-earth. We need to bathe. Balin and Floy blinked in surprise one morning at Harry's outburst and looked to the frown that turned a bit embarrassed as the dark-haired elf crossed his arms and huffed. It's been days. It's gross. Floy huffed, laughing lightly. Is it now? Why boy, how untraveled you are if you cannot even make it a week with a bath. Not to mention privy you state you live in the towns of men of whom I have seen many have not discovered the wonders of plumbing and bathe very infrequent as a result, added the snow-haired dwarf as he finished putting the last roll to Sally. Harry had insisted the pony had needed a name and supplied it when the dwarves seemed short of good suggestion. Harry rolled his eyes. It wasn't the first time the dwarves had brought up the lack of human living. Mostly this led to discussions on poor infrastructure and inability to erect anything as grand as the dwarves' mighty halls. He was not going to allow the two that rant again. It would last the day, and far past the lake he spied in the distance. They had broke the tree line just yesterday, and it had been near eve before they had stopped the night before he had been certain he had spied the gleam of water. That morning, with still a stiff leg and under the ever-watchful eyes of the dwarves, he had scaled the large alder tree they had come to rest under, and confirmed that yes, there was a very crisp clear lake in the distance fed by the nearby runoff from the mountain they could reach within a short time. I do not like to go so long without washing, he said sourly, his shyness from a week prior all but forgotten between the two kind dwarves. They had told him stories every day of their lives and their people, of their amazing customs and lore. He had fallen in love with the dwarves' culture and pressed to know more every day, now feeling as if he had known the two in front of him for a lifetime. The fear of the hatred from his aunt and uncle carried little over to the two, who were so different. As for they had shown him nothing but kindness, and I think Sally would appreciate it as well. She is so dusty. Dust helps keep away the mosquitoes and other vermin, supplied Floy. She is fine. Harry groaned as the dwarf picked him up to set the boy atop the pony. He never fathomed he would have to argue an adult for a bath. But what about germs and bacteria and stuff? He tried, and the two looked to him oddly, like whenever he spouted something odd, which was frequent, seeing as how their worlds differed so much. He was now very much certain he was in a different world and had given up questioning as to why or how. Look, can we not just go to the pond and bathe? He pointed to the direction he had spied the water as they faced slightly away from it, preparing to depart. It wouldn't put us behind so long, would it? I saw some water just there, and I am certain it would be fresh enough to get a drink from as well, since it looks like it's coming from the mountains. The two dwarves exchanged a look, thinking. More drinking water would not be a poor idea, started Balin. We are still several days out from any accessible well, though I am certain a river cuts through in a day's time we could drink from. It would be too fast running to bathe in, but you could always take some and splash it on your face if you were so inclined. Plus there are more beasts that tend to run wild nearer to water such as that, continued Floy, the two seeming to feel their argument was justified and turning Sally to begin a trot in the direction of the Shire. It wouldn't do well to tempt the good fate we have had. By this he meant by the only two skirmishes they had encountered. Once in the middle of the night a few stray goblins had attempted to rob them and grab Harry. Floy had become the beast Harry recalled from the week before and slaughtered them along with Balin. The second time had been in the middle of the day in the thicket's point in the woods, where wolves had came in a small number in attempt to snip at Sally's legs and chance an easy lunch. After injuring several and killing one, they had decided to take their chances elsewhere. Not to mention at night sometimes the two would see fit to teach him some tricks to escaping holds when they had seen his feeble attempt to smack his way out of a goblin's grasp when one had managed to break through Floi and Balin's guard, though not long. That made Harry dirty and sweaty, though it was fun to learn some grappling, and as soon as he was healed up they were going to teach him some fighting moves, for how could they allow him to be so helpless? It made him wish for a bar of soap and shower himself. And after all of that the dwarves, Harry was ready to announce, were in much need of a bath. By the way they had begun to leave the lake he feared the two did not share his sentiments. You guys stink. The two paused and blinked to the boy wide-eyed as his face took on a deep flush and he rushed on. I stink too. You have, like, wolf guts and goblin grossness all over you, and your hands are filthy, and you ate that meat with them. He was becoming more scarlet as he continued on, his voice raising in pitch as their eyes widened and he floundered his hands around. It's gross. It's unsanitary. I normally don't care too much, but this is a lot. Can we please take a small detour? So we can, all, get a bit more clean? At the end of his short rant the two stared in silence and he bowed his head, hunching his shoulders, realizing he probably overstepped a line. He probably should not speak so plainly to them, despite their kindness. He recalled their status in Erebor and he was certain he was rude. He was just beginning to apologize when he saw Floy's shoulders shaking before the two burst out in deep laughter. All right then, Balin wiped a tear from his eye, the elf needs to clean. We stink, do we? Floy turned Sally, chuckling, goblin grossness. Oh my lad, how will I ever teach you to battle with that in mind? Harry didn't mind the slight teasing as they continued, glad they had turned Sally to where he had pointed out the water earlier and made their way to the lake. Ends up bathing with the two had been entertaining to say the least. As for they proceeded to loose at least an hour of travel between the trip, cleaning, and water games, as the two dwarves proved to be rather competitive and refused to loose. A game of deep water keep away with Harry on their backs leading the proceeds. Harry fell asleep next to Balin that night listening to Floyd tell popular dwarven tale, his face hurting from the smile that wouldn't leave it. Equals. It had been nearly 2 weeks of their travels and they were now on the border of the Shire. Harry found himself almost dreading arriving at the Hobbit Bilbo house, knowing that would be where he would have to part ways with the two. He loved how both were wonderful storytellers, and he knew he would miss their kindness that they showed to him. his now nightly sparring matches and their suggestions for his footwork, his fighting style. Their boasting of their skills and their people, their halls of grandeur and their feats. "I wouldn't mind seeing you in your mines," he said, not for the first time since they had spotted small humps in the land that made the rolling hills of the Shire, and began to see people not much taller than Harry himself walking around, stopping to look at the odd group with a mix of fear and awe. Floy laughed and rubbed at his head. Harry had insisted on walking, saying that the pony would tire and he needed to burn off some energy. Truthfully, his legs still throbbed and he at first was uncomfortable walking in the boots that gave him blisters the first few days he walked in them, but he was unwilling to continue sitting on the pony only to have his thoughts wander and haunt him. "For an elf, I find myself welcoming you, and that my dear boy is no small feat, let me tell you." Floy looked ahead, his smile dying down slightly, and Harry wondered if the dwarf was going to be missing him as much as he would the dwarves. "When you come, we will show you the greatest dwarvish hospitality has to offer, and our grand halls will have much to offer you," Balin boasted, grinning at a hobbit as she squeaked at the sight of them before scurrying off and slamming her large red round door behind her. They continued to walk through the winding roads of the Shire, chatting like this about one thing or another. Harry smiled to the surrounding beauty, and he found his heart at ease at the sense of peace that seemed to radiate from the whole Shire, even with the not-so-welcoming residents. It was midday when Balin finally announced they were nearing the particular round door that was Bilbo's home, and Harry found that it was all too soon. He didn't wish to part from his newfound friends. Having finally become comfortable around the two, they had learned he didn't much like being asked questions about himself or speak about his life, and he had found that dwarves loved to boast about themselves and had much pride in their minds. During their 2 weeks they had become rather close, and Harry found himself almost forgetting completely England and his cupboard. The shadows that had always seemed to encase him seemed to not be so stifling at night, and he slept easier than ever. They made their way up a steep winding hill, and near the very top, with a brilliant garden surrounding it, was the green door that Balin pointed to. They tied the pony up outside the gate. Harry gave her a sad pat, and made their way up the path before Balin gave a loud heavy knock. They didn't have to wait very long to hear scuttling and shouting from the other side. "I am already late. I hope whoever it is doesn't need me for too long." By the time he was done saying this, the voice was at the door and throwing it open. Bilbo suddenly jumped, shocked at the company on his doorstep before remembering his manners. "Why, Balin? Such a very long time. Do come in," he said. Harry noticed the hobbit was like many others he had seen. Large bare feet, topped curly brown hair much like the hair on his head, a cheerful face and a round middle, though Bilbo's didn't seem quite so large as some. He was dressed in a bright green tunic with brown pants and had a walking stick in hand and traveling cape on. The three came through the door as Bilbo set his walking stick down and took their things before stopping at Harry's shock on his face. "Oh my word. This is Harry," Balin said, saving Bilbo from his obvious amazement and in forgetting his manners. "We found him lost while on a quest. Which is why we came to see you. I know how you're a friend of those in Rivendell." Bilbo's eyes were shining with wonder and he had a grin on his face. "Why, I had never thought I would see an elf child in all my years. Why, where are my manners? Please, come make yourselves comfortable, we can discuss this all over tea." He said this while revealing them of their traveling gear and allowing Floyd to bow and introduce himself. He showed them to the sitting room and he started a fire while putting a kettle on and grabbing a tea set with some scones. He handed a cookie to Harry with a wink and Harry smiled, thanking him for it. Smiling at the sweet taste on his tongue, a welcome change from the bland soup they had been eating, having run out of carrots and there had been little luck with rabbit the past week. After he set everything up, and the kettle finally boiled, all the while chatting with Balin, Bilbo served his guests tea and seed cake and then sat down. Now then, despite his cheery demeanor, Bilbo took a rather serious tone that Harry was surprised he was able to make. "You have something to ask of me, I believe." "Yes, I do, my friend." Balin set his china down and looked hard at Bilbo. "Harry here is lost, and my kin are on a quest to reclaim our mines. We found him wandering the wilds, far from any elves, and seeming to be far from any place that I have ever heard of." Bilbo's eyes practically shined with interest and he leaned forward. "Is that so, my boy? Where is it you come from?" Harry shuffled and tried not to appear nervous. "I come from a place called England. In the town of Surrey," he trailed off. He wasn't a whiz with his geography, but he knew for a fact he had never once heard anything about Middle-earth. The thought that he came to another world passed his mind, not for the first time. He didn't say this though, finding it better to not seem any stranger than he already did. No, I have never heard of England either. Amazing. This is simply amazing. Suddenly Bilbo seemed to shake from a trance and frowned. Oh, but you poor boy, away from the elves, and at such a young age. We must remedy this. Can't have you come to any harm after all? Harry nodded numbly. Knowing what was coming next, he would be parting ways with the only two friends he had in this world. Or any two he had ever made, really. Which is why I thought of you, being a friend of the elves and all, Balin confirmed, and Bilbo was nodding his head. Of course, he smiled. I wouldn't miss a chance to go to see the elves again. I quite enjoy Rivendell, and it has been quite some time since I have been there. Floy finally spoke up from where he had been silently watching the exchange. If I may say, Master Baggins, but it seemed as if we interrupted your leaving. Bilbo nodded but waved his head. No worries, no worries. I was just off to collect my favorite nephew for the month. You see, we share the same birthday, and I much rather enjoy his company, so I often steal him away to come be with me. It is quite all right. I apologize that we interrupted your celebration, Balin said politely. Bilbo shook his head, smiling, and waved it off. It is truly fine, Balin. Quite all right, quite all right. Bilbo was obviously still much too interested with Harry to care about the change of plans, so Harry, Bilbo seemed to play the name on his tongue much like Floy had done, unused to it. You must be exhausted. Would you like for me to show you to a nice comfortable bed? Harry looked to Balin and Floy before slowly nodding. Yes, please. Thank you. It was true he was tired. Bilbo smiled and gestured for the boy to follow him. Harry's limp was thankfully gone, because despite his portly build, Bilbo was a rather fast mover, scurrying around fussing about one thing or another, mumbling, seeing how he had an elfing as a guest. They made it to the room, which wasn't far from the sitting room at all, and he showed Harry where all the necessities were. It was very homey, if not a bit chilled in the late fall cold. There was a bed that was just large enough for Harry, with several heavy quilts on it that had many images that seemed to tell a story, though Harry wasn't interested at the moment. His head hurt thinking of how Balin and Floy would soon be leaving. There was a chair and a writing desk, and a mirror was just visible from the small bathroom. He was surprised there was a toilet. He hadn't known this world would have them, but was thankful for that luxury, with a sink above it with a pump to run the water by hand. Bilbo went to go start a fire in the hearth as Harry stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, and while he did, he began talking, his bright green back and brown curls the only thing Harry could see. So Harry, where are your parents? How did you ever end up in the wilds by yourself? He leaned back as a small flame burst to life on the tender and began to slowly add small dry shavings to help it grow. Well, sir, I am an orphan. Harry cringed, hating to bring up his parents. I live with my human aunt and uncle and cousin. I honestly am as confused as about how I got where I did as anyone else. He recited what Floy and Balin said would be most appropriate to tell Bilbo, knowing that the curious hobbit would surely ask. They said it would be strange if he hadn't known he was an elf. It was strange still to refer himself as one, but he supposed that was why odd things always happened around him, and it would also be odd even for an elf if he said he had transported himself through a door. He had told Floy and Balin a few nights ago when asked that he had fallen through a door, wishing it would have brought him elsewhere. They had gave each other a worried look before saying that may be best kept secret, also the fact he may have been from another world. Bilbo was silent, having added some smaller logs to what was now a growing fire, and he seemed to be thinking. How old are you, child? 10. Harry frowned down at his short stature, knowing he looked only to be around 5. Bilbo nodded, humming in thought, still not having turned to him. I thought you would have been older. I mean no offense when I say it is rather difficult to tell with your kind, for how long you live and all. Harry just hummed his agreement, waving off any offered apology from the hobbit. The fire was crackling and the room was now a more cheery, lighter color. Harry's head went from throbbing to pounding, and he only wished to crawl under the covers and not be asked any more questionings. Bilbo stood and seemed to see Harry for the first time and frowned. You looked absolutely exhausted. You go ahead and get some rest, and we'll talk more in the morning. As Bilbo began to leave, Harry made a noise of protest which stopped him. Am I going to be able to see Balin and Floy before they leave? Harry wrung his hands together, fidgeting. Oh yes, of course, I wouldn't let them leave so soon. I must feed them, and let them rest. No, you will be able to say goodbye to them over breakfast in the morning. Harry relaxed and smiled. Thank you, for everything. Anything to help, he said, and bid him good night before leaving the room. Harry slowly slid on the bed, hearing soon the deep laughter from the dwarves in the distance as the three adults chattered. He felt the familiar presence of whatever it was that followed him in the dark, lingering in the shadows of the room. His heart pounded against his chest, and he felt his fear rise, but he stubbornly refused to show his fear, screwing his eyes shut, forcing his breathing to slow. He felt a cold breeze brush past him, and exhaustion suddenly clouded his mind, forcing him to sleep. The last thing he heard was the all-too-familiar voice. "The Hobbit carries something of great interest. I may find a greater use in this world than I originally thought." Chapter 4. Harry awoke heart-pounding, with the feeling as if he wasn't alone in the now very dark room. The house was silent, unfamiliar, and the shadows stretched out surrounding him. A whisper came from the corner near the foot of his bed in a hiss of a voice, and Harry quickly scurried off the bed, throwing the comforter at the corner. He had become accustomed to Floyd's strong arms awaiting him to scurry into their embrace, and felt panicked at it, knowing where the dwarf slept. Breathing heavily, he attempted to assure himself that there was nothing scary, there were no monsters, and he needed to go back to sleep. But before he could even begin to regulate his breathing, a small cackling noise sounded from the corner, and soon his comforter began to rise up. Afraid to stay a second longer, Harry bolted to the door and scurried out, not thinking to close the door behind him. Silently he ran down the hall to where moonlight spilled through a new exterior window and slowed at the sound of hushed voices coming from the sitting room where fire and candlelight flicked dimly. Steadying his breath, Harry crept soundlessly to where the two adults spoke, his curiosity making him forget his fright. "I know how you felt, laddie. Thorin's and the boys' death affected you more deeply than any of us, and we were kin." Harry peered around the corner to see Balin rubbing a worn-looking Bilbo's shoulders as the other cradled his head in one hand, a glass of wine left empty next to him. Bilbo, whom had been so cheery and joyful earlier that day, took a shaky breath. "I told myself it would get better. Another 25-30 years and I would pass away, not having to keep remembering him ask forgiveness." Not still of movement and without breath, another shaky breath, and he ran a hand through his curls. "Yet here I am, not looking a day older." Balin nodded sympathetically. "Whatever it was you felt for Thorin and the boys, it will not age or pass, lad. I would like to believe that the day the world is renewed, all dwarves shall awaken in the halls of Mahal, ready to face a new life." He lifted Bilbo's chin. "Bilbo, Thorin's last wish was to be with you when the world was renewed. Perhaps this is a sign from Mahal." Bilbo didn't seem convinced, but he didn't look as if he had the energy to argue or was trying to find some comfort in the advice. "I am just glad that at least we were friends, and he was in his right mind when he left this world." The hobbit let out a whoosh of air, running a hand through his curls. Harry noticed the other hand play with something in his pocket. Harry felt wrong suddenly, knowing this was a private conversation and he shouldn't have listened in. Turning, he began to turn back in search of Floyd, but when he turned his gaze down the hall, there was the unmistakable sight of a pale face with hollow eyes in the unnatural darkness of the hall. His heart thudded in his rib cage painfully and he was frozen. As he watched, the monster began to move along as if slithering, snapping Harry out of his trance. With a scream, Harry ran to the adults who had stood at his commotion, and he flung himself to Balin, breathing deeply as he tried to explain about monsters in the house. Unable to understand him through the sobs, Balin and Bilbo both tried to calm him, and not long after Floyd burst in, axes at the ready, only to see Harry sobbing into Balin's shoulder as Bilbo glanced up at him with a frown. "What happened?" he whispered gruffly as he lowered his axes and began to approach. At hearing his voice, Harry shot over to him and latched onto him. Floyd, there's a monster in my bedroom. I saw it in the hall too," he said in a shaky voice as he looked up with large teary eyes to the dwarf. Floyd looked to the others. He remembered similar nights with his own son, over similar matters, and even though it was the worst, this wasn't the first night Harry had been frightened. Looking back at Harry's large eyes, he stroked his hair. "Would you like me to go check?" At Harry's look of horror, he stepped back in mock hurt. "You don't trust my strength?" Harry slowly shook his head, making Floyd smile, and lifted up one of his heavy and sharp axes. "If there be a beast, I will away it with Volnric and Rornric, who have silenced many vermin in their time." At Harry's loosened grip, he stood and made his way down the hall, and with Harry, Bilbo, and Balin following. Harry clutched his pant leg at the entrance to the room the child had slept in, and it lit up when Bilbo lit an oil lamp. Although no dwarf needed much light, for dwarves were able to see in the darkness of caves and tunnels. The room appeared as it should, besides the large blanket in the middle of the floor. After picking it up, depositing it on the bed, Floy looked to Harry, who barely had passed the threshold, looking frustrated. "You're going to say that I had a bad dream. I wasn't dreaming, though." Harry stamped a foot, hands in fists by his sides. His green eyes were glossy, but he refused to let any tears fall. Floy nodded, and opened his arms for the boy to come to. This wasn't the first night Harry was sure that there really were monsters in the darkness. It had become a habit for their bedrolls to be near one another, so whenever Harry woke up afraid he could go straight to one of the dwarves' arms, normally Floy's. Balin would cuddle the child as well. Having helped raise his own brother, he was well used to it, but the time of him raising young ones had long since passed while it still rang fresh in Floy's blood. "Come, Nidoyth. You have strength in your heart, and with me you shall have strength of arms. I shall protect you until you gain the power to do so yourself. Then I shall continue protecting you even then." He hugged the fragile child, much thinner and delicate than any Darrow babe, and it was as if he were chained down when Short Arms Barley reached around his neck and his heart clenched painfully, not for the first time cursing those who could put a child in such fear, even a tree hugger's. "No, then I shall protect you," corrected Harry, snuggling into his neck, and all of Floy's strength seemed to leave him as he remembered his wee boy saying something similar. Floy turned, ignoring the other two's smiles. "I will take him to my room to sleep. We need our rest for the trip to Bree." At his leaving, Bilbo sighed. "This is why I could never be a good father." He smiled weakly to Balin. "I don't know how to help in situations like that." Patting his long-time friend's shoulder, Balin shook his head. "Nor I did enough practically raising Thorin and Dwalin. No need to repeat it with my own. Though Dwalin got the gift of good parenting. You would never guess just by looking at him how much of a softie he is." Bilbo chuckled, going to put away their drinking glasses before freezing and staring at the framed map of the Lonely Mountain that had begun the earlier conversation. "You were good enough for two lads," Balin soothed, taking the tray from Bilbo, giving him a gentle shove. "Go rest, my friend. Tomorrow we stop in Bree before heading down the road." Bilbo himself nodded, heart heavy and eyes cloudy, and he quickly scurried to his room, shutting the door softly. Laying down without even changing, he stroked the ring in his pocket, trying to push the voice from his mind that sung about dragonfire and dwarven gold. The memory never seeming to dull. Even to this day it was as if Thorin and the others were singing in his front room, playing instruments softly deep into the night. Bilbo knew he would not sleep well. It had been many years he had slept well at all. Meanwhile, Harry finally settled down with Floy and was twirling a beaded braid in the other's beard. Floy didn't mind, the child having grown on him quickly, and was welcome to his beard like any son of his would be allowed to. He had not informed Harry of how much dwarves treasured their beards, but he hoped he was able to show how much the child meant to him now. "Are they alive, Floy?" Floy blinked and looked down to large emerald eyes looking up to him in wonder. "I'm sorry, my boy," he responded, "but who do you speak of?" The emerald eyes blinked. "Your axes, you called them." "Volnric and Rornric," finished Floy as he adjusted himself and Harry so the boy lay against his chest and he propped himself up. "Yes, they are. You must remember, Harry, dwarves are able to hear the language of stone and rock. We believe as much in their life as we do our own. Weapons are forged with careful thought as to how they are forged, formed, and the materials used. When a weapon is made, it is born. It goes into a battle to earn its name, its identity, its legacy. One weapon may pass through many hands, for many generations, seeing countless battles and never tire." Looking down, he smiled at seeing the boy breathing ease and eyes closed. A pang shot through Floy's heart looking down at the delicate elfling sleep. They had bonded over the travel to the Shire, and he was more fond of the child than he originally would have assumed. It was no secret that Floy missed his own son, and that it had been what originally pushed him to accompany the boy to the Shire and, as they had agreed while the child slept, to Bree before going their separate paths so as to hopefully not run into the elves. Not only were relationships tense between the two races, but the dwarves were on a mission to take back Moria from the filth that had infested its way into their grand halls, which was no way place to keep Harry, sweet soft-spoken Harry, who opened up to them finally enough to seek comfort in their arms. He thought back to the past few weeks on how Harry had slowly opened up from his quiet self and conversed with them more. He didn't like to speak of himself, or home, but was very inquisitive about everything. Especially all things dwarvish. "Should have been born a dwarro," he murmured, and the other sighed almost as if in response. As a dwarf child, Floy knew they would have raised Harry right. There would not be one scar to blemish his skin, or the haunted look the child sometimes wore. He wouldn't flinch and fear angering others and would speak with strength in his voice, no waver heard. Sighing, Floy shook his head. There was no point in dreaming of the impossible. He will grow to be just like any other pointy-eared bastard, Floy reminded himself. He won't have anything for you, not even the breath of his time. Despite his words, Floy just hugged the boy tighter. Now if only convince his heart of that. Chapter 5. They had been traveling for only 2 days and Floy was pleased to see that Harry had quickly warmed up to the hobbit. That morning after the monster incident, Harry had been so happy, over the moon happy, when it was announced they would be traveling together at least to Bree, that he had launched himself across table to Floy, who grumbled in embarrassment, hiding his smirk behind his beard while ruffling the boy's hair. They had decided to stay one more day at Bilbo's home, washing themselves, and emptying his food stores the rest of the way. It really does need to be emptied if I am taking such an extended trip, you see. No harm done, Bilbo had said, waving away any worry that Harry had voiced. And no sane dwarf ever turned down the offer of good food and drink. Little Harry even had loosened up to show his love of sweets. The honeycakes were quickly devoured and Bilbo made sure to pack a few for the trip. Floy had to stop himself from puffing his chest out proudly when Bilbo commented that Harry had quite the healthy appetite. Any dwarf worth their beard would see that as a compliment to the health and strength of their own. Plus this was a hobbit who took their food and appetite very seriously, according to Balin. But this is where Floy always caught himself. Right when he begun to play the role as Harry's father, he would stop. Not only was Harry an elf, a bloody tree shagger for goodness sake, there was no way that he would ever do well under a dwarf's care. Even if dwarves had better tastes in architecture for their homes, and skill for finding precious gems. I think here would be a good stop, Balin said as he spied an area slightly off the well-walked road to Bree, where a couple rocks that had obviously been used in the past by others to perch upon and create campfires in the center of was. The sun was setting, causing the skies to turn shades of red to gold, and Floy's heart ached a moment at the colors, thoughts returning to Erebor, and the memories of sunsets that would crest the mountain of his homeland. Though the powerful squeeze of longing in his heart did nothing compared to the small gentle squeeze of his hand. Looking down, already knowing what he would see, he met a pair of emerald green eyes shining up at him. Yes. He raised a thick eyebrow at Harry's serious face. Or as serious as a small child could look. Those large eyes were gazing at him in an attempt to look hardened, his cheeks puffed out and bottom lip stuck out. It was downright adorable and Floy wasn't going to try and deny it. In response, Harry squeezed his hand tighter with his own little one before opening his mouth. Are you okay? Blinking, Floy grinned, lifting Harry to his hip and following Bilbo and Balin over to camp. And, pray tell, what makes you believe that I am not? He said in a light tone. Do I see Mill? Harry blinked and shook his head before biting his lip. Floy recognized the action well. Harry was ever the insecure child, and Floy did everything he could to reassure the boy that he would not get into trouble for making comments or asking questions. He himself had to refrain from asking Harry why he was like this, because in his heart he already knew as to why. And his heart nor his mind liked it. It is all right, my boy. He gave a small squeeze as he went to a rock over by where Bilbo seemed to be setting up the campfire. Balin took to perching on the tallest rock to get a good scout of the area. I could never be angered at you. You may speak freely what is on your mind. Green eyes looked up at him, searching for something. They found it and softened ever so slightly before turning away as the boy fiddled with a jacket Bilbo had hemmed to have fit him, the green going well with his eyes. I feel, he spoke quietly, that you were sad. Or sad? Are you missing someone? Floy could honestly say that was the last thing he had expected. He had watched the boy before, knowing the child did a lot of thinking and observing. But never had he considered the boy to be so insightful onto others' emotions. Yes, he said softly after a moment, looking back to the receding colors of the sunset. Yes, I do. Home. I miss it dearly. Why don't you go home then? The lonely mountain, right? Suddenly his eyes took a glint and he sat up straighter, and excited energy thrumming through his little body. You could take me. And I could see the mines, and the mountain, and all the different guilds and watch you all work. Maybe you could even teach me to make jewelry. It was his craft, a jeweler. As such he often the need to play with an array of valuable rock to make a living. Jewelry being the main source of income. I do not think that is possible, he grunted, crossing his arms and went to the pony to grab some things. Even though I do miss it, I must go to Moria. The though of his child came to him, and his grip on the wheatstone that he had retrieved from the saddlebag tightened. Harry, sensing the change in Floy, lowered his head and softened his voice. In the background, Balin and Bilbo were talking softly about something. I know, he whispered as Floy seated himself next to the elf child, but I still wish. Floy felt a quick squeeze around his heart before he sighed and took out Volnric and Rornric out to sharpen their blades. It was a peaceful exercise that normally helped his aching heart. It is not a place for an elf, Floy said, finally trying to bring reason to the child. You would not like it there. Harry, the stubborn boy, folded his arms across his chest, still not looking up to the dwarf. You don't know that. Floy shook his head. Harry, I know elves, and elves do not have a love for cold stone or dark mountains. Then maybe I don't want to be an elf. Bright teary eyes turned to him, lip quivering. Balin and Bilbo had stopped their conversation to look at them in concern. Blinking, Floy frowned in annoyance. It was a mere dream of his to wish the dark-haired child had been born of stone by Mahal's hands, and not of whatever the elves found themselves made of. Probably bloody trees. Do not be ridiculous. You are an elf and there is no changing that. We will take you to Bree before we depart to our mines, and you to your trees. Then, when you are among your own people, you will find that you are truly happy. His words became rough and cold, he knew. But it was a truth they had to face, and he was unwilling to pretend it wasn't to come. A sniff brought his attention to the tears rolling down the boy's chubby cheeks as a little hand wiped at his nose, effectively rubbing dirt from one side of his face to the other. Fine, the boy jumped down, fine. And he ran over to Bilbo, whom he had warmed up to so fast. Floy told himself he should be happy. Why would his heart not agree on these matters? Equals 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 equals. 'Twasn't very kind of you to deny the child some hope. Balin was seated next to him, smoking a pipe, as was he. Said child was nestled in the blankets with Bilbo, face pressed against his hands as it scrunched up in dream. It is better this way, Floy said, sighing. Balin raised a brow but didn't argue any further. It truly is, he said, feeling silently challenged. Soon he will be with those elves. He spat the word out as if it were a curse, and he will grow to be just like the lot of them. Stuffy, nose in the air, tree-shagging pricks who live in their unsound structures. Don't even have the sense to live in stone. He stopped, realizing Balin was chuckling and he was ranting. You do not know what it is Harry will truly grow up to be, mused the snow-haired dwarf, and he took a long drag from his pipe before continuing. None of us will. We have never seen anything truly like him, an elf living with humans? From another world? It is unlikely we will live to see him for anything but what he is now, Harry. And Floy's heart twisted as Balin said this. Oh, would it stop, he thought, annoyed, stop twisting and clutching at every thought of the boy? He didn't say anything as Balin went off to take first watch. Being a dwarf, he was able to see in the blackness as well as any other of his kind, but he was particularly gifted in being able to sense evil in the dark. Floy still didn't say anything as Harry groaned, face turning into a grimace as he entered one of his many nightmares. How had one boy, one elf boy, affected him so much so fast? As a small sob escaped the boy, he sighed and tapped out his pipe on his boot before stowing it away in his pocket to go over and crouch to the child. Pushing some strands of hair from his eyes, he made shushing noises. It is all right, Harry. I am here. I have already promised I would protect you. I am not about to back out of that promise. The whimpers subsided and the boy's face smoothed out with a calmed sigh. Satisfied Harry would rest peacefully now, he went to his bedroll and laid down, not even bothering to grab his blanket to cover himself. Closing his eyes, he started to drift to sleep before jerking at the feel of a blanket being thrown over him, and then blinked in surprise as a small figure curled up under it against his chest before he could even react. I'm sorry I upset you, Harry said in a very small voice. He squeezed the boy to him and felt small arms squeeze him back. You did not upset me, child. I upset myself, and I was a fool to take it out on you. A small head shook back and forth across his broad chest. They lay there, breaths evening. He was sure the boy was now asleep, and he himself felt as if he was losing consciousness. Just before he did, he heard a small voice carry words that were so groundbreaking. "I love you, Floy." Oh, how weak and small his heart was, he thought as he forced the tears to not fall in his arms to pull the child in even closer. Weak and small, and somehow melding to make room for the green-eyed boy. Equals 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 equals. It took another 2 days for them to reach the town of Bree, and when they did, Harry was obviously distraught. Floy himself found that this parting was going to be most difficult, and he had to keep telling himself it was for the better. "Look over there, Harry," Bilbo said with a smile, always one to try and lighten the mood. "There are children singing some nursery rhymes." And there were about 5 human children, 3 of them playing jump rope in an area that had not been overrun by water with the previous rain, and were going through rhymes while jumping in step. The 2 jumping tripped and fell suddenly, and the whole group laughed. Harry himself turned away. "I don't know those rhymes," he said softly. Bilbo smiled kindly as Balin patted his head before heading off to find himself and Floy some fast ponies. Harry tried not to cry. "I would be interested to hear what children rhymes you have back home," murmured Floy, trying to cheer the boy up. Harry blinked up at him and smiled a little shaky. "I know a few playing rhymes and songs mommies and daddies sing. But I normally don't sing them." His eye narrowed in on something on the ground and his smile grew. "There is one song I always liked though." "I would love to hear it," Floy said, and it was the truth. Harry didn't sing often, but when he did, it was very pleasant and calming. A sweet little voice that would touch Floy's heart, no matter the silly childish words, or lack thereof. Harry bit his lip, thinking before clasping his hands behind him and opening his mouth. Instead of the normal soft voice he used while signing to himself, though, he sang loud and clear, bringing his eyes to a close as his brows knit together and the feeling of want pulled at the slowing crowd's attention. "The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping, I dreamed I held you in my arms. But when I awoke, dear, I was mistaken, so I hung my head and I cried. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away." Harry had cut off abruptly upon opening his eyes and seeing many watery gazes his way, and many more of awe and curiosity. Floy himself had been one of them. Having been so near the child, he had knelt down to comment on the song when suddenly feeling the gazes. Looking up and tensing, he suddenly realized every eye was now on them, or more specifically Harry. "Come, let us get an inn," growled Floy lowly. How stupid. Of course all around them would be shocked by seeing an elf child. In the 2 months he had been with the boy, it had become such a common thing that he nearly forgot how rare elves did have children. As they made their way to the inn, he shot glares at all the murmuring people who were looking at the group with wide eyes. "An elf child? That's not possible. I didn't think they could. It's with a dwarf and a hobbit though. What an odd group. Perhaps it is just a hobbit babe. No, we hobbits would not put shoes on our children, and where are his curls?" It continued this way the whole time, and Floy found himself practically snarling at the others when he got to the door. How stupid, he kept kicking himself, to tell an ELF child to sing and gain attention of the townsfolk. How very stupid. They got a room for Bilbo and Harry. He kept telling himself it was fine if he and Balin left that evening, even though his stomach turned. Bilbo did have a small little thing he insisted was a sword sting, and he didn't argue. It had seen combat in the tale of the Hobbit who traveled with Thorin and company and actually went face to face with a dragon. Though seeing the soft little thing, it was hard to swallow. He hoped that would be any enemy's disadvantage if they did decided to confront the two. They went into their room and Bilbo said that he would go inquire about getting some heated water for a bath. "Harry is absolutely filthy, and I know I would much rather be a little less smelly when arriving to Rivendell than I have been in the past." "I'm sorry." Floy blinked. He looked down at the large eyes and softened his gaze. "What for, my boy?" "For making everyone look at us." He blinked and bit his lip, looking sideways as if in thought, "Though I find it strange they all knew I was an elf when I sang." Floy went from wanting to hug the boy to smashing his own head against the wall. "And they said dwarves were thick." "It was your voice, lad," he said, shaking his head. "No living thing in Middle-earth would possess such a voice and not be an elf." "Oh." Harry seemed to be thinking about something, quite seriously. though Floyd couldn't help but smile as the child contemplated over the townsfolk reaction to his voice, much like a dwarf trying to figure out a battle strategy. I would think it best to keep the signing to a minimum until you reach your home. He didn't miss the flinch the boy made at that and sighed as he walked over to the bed with the now quivering lad. Sitting down, he hugged the boy and Harry hugged him back. Now Harry, he murmured into the unruly black hair, you know, when I was just a lad, I think about equal in age to yourself, my father had to leave me as well. Large eyes widened and his mouth formed a tiny, oh. Not stopping, he sighed, you see, it had been when I was a child Smaug the dragon attacked. I know Balin and Bilbo have told you tales of the Wyrm. Harry nodded again, suddenly gripping onto him as if the dragon were there with him, holding his breath. The boy loved stories. We made it out alive, he sighed, smiling weakly to the boy, my mother, father, and myself. We became homeless and wanderers, losing all our titles and wealth in a matter of minutes. Weeks of traveling the lands, and we found a town my father and mother could take up work in, that would allow us rooms so long as we paid rent. Then why did your daddy leave? He asked in a cute voice. Floy sighed, because of duty, Harry. The king called his people to battle the goblins that had infested Moria at that time. I remember as a boy I had not wished my father to go. It was dangerous, and I was frightened for him, but I did not despair, for I knew he would be going for the honor of my people. For you wished to give us a new home. He paused before pulling out a stone from his pocket. He gave this to me, as his father had given him when he himself had went out to battle the first time. He gave it to me saying that I would be fighting my own battles in his absence and I must take care of my mother and myself. So you weren't sad? Harry watched as Floy fingered the runes carved into the stone lovingly. No, Floy shook his head, my da was leaving. I was very sad, but, he hugged Harry, pressing the stone into his small hands. Harry was surprised that it felt warm, as if it were alive. I loved him very much and believed in his return. Did he return? Harry's voice was impossibly small as he looked down at the stone in his hands. Floy nodded, yes. It took 2 years, and during that time I found my strength. When he returned, he saw how I handled the axe, and how I had grown during his absence, and he was proud. I want you to do the same for me, Harry. Harry's head shot up, wide eyes looking to him. You promise you will return? I cannot promise anything, child, he murmured. As for when we retake Moria, I will be one of its lords and will have to rule. But I shall write you. And you shall always be welcome in our halls. Until then, take care of my ruin until you see me again. Draw strength from it. Harry's face went from hopeful to determined so fast Floy wondered how he managed. I will, Floy. His voice was stronger than Floy had ever heard it and full of power. Floy felt his heart swell. I will make you proud. And when I am bigger, I will go to Moria and I will show you how strong I have become. Pulling the boy up into a hug, Floy could not stop his smiling. You have the heart of a dwarf lad. Let it never rust or break. Harry squeezed him and murmured, you may not think much of trees or flowers or green stuffs. And I may not know much of stone and rock. Even tough, we are so different. He took a shuddering breath. I still wish you could be my da. And there it was. He laid a heavy hand on the boy's heart. In here, my boy, I am. And that is what matters. They didn't say anything more. Just continued to hug, knowing that it would be their last one for a very long time. Chapter 6 Chapter Summary. This is a somewhat wordy chapter, but I hope you still like it. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Harry woke late the next morning, feeling groggy and exhausted as if he hadn't slept at all. His nose was terribly stuffy, his head throbbed, and he just knew his eyes were red and puffy from a good dose of crying. Ah, good morning there, my lad, Bilbo said from where he was seated by the window, a book in hand. He closed it gently and gave a small smile. Are you hungry at all? I got us a little something before we take to the road. Harry knew he should feel hungry. He hadn't eaten well the night before, but he couldn't find it in him to even think of his stomach. More so he thought of the heavy feeling on his chest, loss still twisting at his heart, accompanied by the warmth of the stone Floy had given him in his pocket. Not particularly, he murmured, not wishing to be rude. Bilbo was a kind soul, and Harry did like him very much. Bilbo paused, looking at him before nodding a bit. All right then, he said gently, I will pack plenty for the road. We can leave soon. Harry nodded and was thankful for Bilbo giving him space. It gave him time to think. He had promised Floy he would become strong. There was no way he would ever back down from that promise. But at the same time, Harry felt a way he never had felt before. It was as if his chest were weighed down yet was incredibly empty at the same time. His stomach twisted not from hunger, but with every thought of how he wished Floy was with him, and he felt drained as if he could easily crawl back into bed and sleep his life away. The sun that shot in sharply between the drab curtains was not as inviting as it used to be, and he sat on the bed feeling lost. This was a sadness unlike any that Harry had experienced in his 10 years. This was different than when other kids jested him about being an orphan. Different than when the Dursleys did nothing but look on at him in disgust, and he could never please them. This wasn't like any sort of sadness stemming from the lack of love or companionship. This was from loss. Before coming to Middle-earth, Harry had nothing to ever lose, so it was new to him. And at the moment, Harry felt very much like the small child he appeared to be. Getting up, which felt like it took a greater effort than it normally did, he padded silently over to where Bilbo was packing their things neatly and organized. The hobbit was only slightly taller than himself, the creatures not being very tall at all. He stood silent for a moment, unable to form words, and decided to turn around and go sit at the desk. He did so for a few moments, but it aggravated him, so he stood and padded over to one of his bags next to Bilbo's own and stared at it, unsure of what he was doing. "When I first lost my parents," Bilbo spoke suddenly, hands not stopping from their task and his eyes never leaving the careful folding of clothing and packing of long-term foods, "I would often walk the halls of my home as if I was searching for them. I knew they were not there." He closed his bag, ensuring it stayed tightly shut before looking up to the boy still crouched by him, "but something inside me searched for them. It was as if the pain wanted to leave my body but couldn't, so it forced me to move without purpose." Harry blinked but said nothing, though it didn't deter Bilbo, who stood with a thoughtful, almost wistful look for a moment. "I was able to overcome that by delving into my books. You see, as a lad I had always wanted adventure. To go off wandering with elves, to see distant places and live an exciting life like my mother always told stories of, or Gandalf would come and tell me about. But I never did." Bilbo shook his head. "My parents needed me suddenly, and I lost them. First my father, then my mother. I couldn't let go of the place where I last saw them, their lingering memories. My mother's fine china. My father's armchair. I couldn't leave it. Objects became precious, and yet I still couldn't rid of the energy. The energy that urged me to move, but only to nothing." Harry listened. He wished for Bilbo to bestow some sort of secret to him to break him of his pain. "One day, in my father's study, I curled up as I had on his chair, wishing he was sitting in it instead of me." He shook his head. "I don't know why, but I just sat there for a while until I realized I was staring at a book left on his desk. I had not touched anything in my father's study or my mother's garden since their passing, so I knew it must have been the last book he had touched. And, well, something in me wanted to read it. So I did. And then another and another. I found myself immersing myself in books. My father liked many dry texts about proper grape growing and winemaking, about things about the weather. I read them, and when I read them I found I felt more alive than ever, and so I looked for more." He smiled, wistful. "It was books, dear Harry, that pulled me from my sorrow. I had fallen from such sadness to my books. I found I rather liked studying maps, and would get my hands on anything I could read of Middle-earth. Sadly, in the Shire there is little of that. Many years later I was a changed hobbit. I was comfortable living the life I had found with my books, my father's armchair, my mother's china, until a wizard came wandering to my doorstep. He introduced me to—" Bilbo found his voice catch in his throat, and his eyes closed on their own accord as his brows knit. "Well, let's just say they were a ridiculous lot, weren't they? Those boys, oh those boys were so rowdy. And he—" Bilbo's eyes opened, staring longingly out the window. "He was magnificent. And in the matter of a year, when I had found a new family, found love in others which I never thought I could, it was all gone again. That loneliness was back, that energy to keep moving. I left. I came back home. I wanted my books." Bilbo's smile was watery and he gave a shaky sigh, brushing a stray tear away. "I'm sorry, my boy. Some pain, even though it dulls, never leaves us, but as I said, I returned home. I would try and read my books, yet they did little good for me. I would go on longer and longer walks, but never could find what I searched for. Until one day someone asked me to tell them what had happened. And I told the story. I told my story, their stories, all the stories I could think of. I began to write some fanatical made-up stories, and some that stemmed from truth. But in that, I still find solace. In stories and in talking I find what peace I can. Harry, he held the small hand in his, looking into the boy's eyes earnestly. I do not know how to help you until you are able to see Floy again. But you must not let your sorrow consume you. For it will drain way at you until you find how to combat it. I would hate for Floy to see you or know you are burdened with such sorrow. Bilbo, his voice was small and wavery. Yes, my dear boy. I want to go now. I don't want to sit around anymore, and keep thinking of Floy being gone, he thought. Bilbo seemed to understand though and nodded quickly, packing up the rest of their things as Harry grabbed his own small pack. He eyed the sword on Bilbo's hip suddenly. Will you teach me to use a sword? Awami? Bilbo seemed slightly flustered and looked down to the elvish blade as if he had forgotten it had even been there. Ah ha ha, well you see lad, I myself am not very well versed in the acts of combat. But you have to know be more than me, Harry pleaded, suddenly feeling a fire spark within him. That determination to become stronger for Floy suddenly flaring up, that energy Bilbo spoke of, and it would be good if I were to learn. I need to grow stronger. Bilbo blinked before a smile started to form across his face, an understanding blossoming in his eyes. Well, all right then. We can see what we can do. Though I warn you I was being honest in my lack of skill. That's all right. I want to learn, Harry said, grabbing his own small pack as Bilbo slung his over his shoulders and grabbed his walking stick. They began to make their way out the door and down the stairs. Bilbo paid for a few apples down at the front desk and thanked them for the kind service before they followed the man to the stalls where their pony awaited. After loading up the brown shaggy pony, we will have to name him, Bilbo had said. They made their way out of town to Rivendell. They rode in a comfortable silence, as both were prone to having, Harry watching his breath come out in small puffs of visible air in the chilly morning. The frost having melted under the sun's heat, but the air still chilled. The glint of Bilbo's sword off the late morning sun brought his attention. When will you start teaching me? Harry asked, thumbing the etched ruins of the stone in his pocket. Bilbo blinked as if he had been lost in thought before suddenly remembering his earlier promise to teach the lad how to use a sword. Well, he tapped his chin, I suppose as soon as possible. He trailed off and Harry looked to him wide-eyed as Bilbo became serious and looked to him sternly. I suppose lesson 1 is the most important of all, one that I learned long before I owned my very own sword. Harry leaned forward, nodding his head in encouragement as Bilbo unsheathed the small sword, mindful of the small elf in front of him, and held it out for the other to look at. And in a very serious and stern voice he said, while pointing, this end you hold. The pointy end goes in the bad guy's squishy parts. Don't let it get you or it hurts. A lot. Harry stared at Bilbo, who slowly began to smile at Harry felt his own face widening. Pretty soon they both were laughing, tears coming out of their eyes. Okay, you've proved yourself, Harry laughed, you truly do not know much of anything. Now see here you rascal, that was a free lesson, do not be so ungrateful, Bilbo sniffed, sticking his nose in the air, grinning. Harry laughed and then felt his stomach rumble. Ears reddening he looked up to the hobbit's knowing gaze. Bilbo, I think I'm hungry now. Equals 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 equals. They had traveled carefully for 6 days and were extremely close to the last homely house, according to Bilbo. It had snowed shortly after their leave of Bree, and it made traveling very uncomfortable and a tad more difficult. They were now in the Trollshaw Pass though, carefully finding caves and trees to rest in. Never know when goblins or trolls could be setting traps, Bilbo had said, recalling his own run-in with them, which overlooked a plain that he had explained he and the dwarves had fled across and stumbled upon secret road to Rivendell, unlike the main eastern road they now took. But why not go take the shorter route? Harry asked, blowing into his numb fingers. Even though Bilbo had even handed him his pair of mittens to go over Harry's, he still felt chilled. I would never be able to properly find it, Bilbo shrugged as they walked the path through the fresh snow, looking out to the stretch of grass and rock, inspecting their chances to scale the small hills they currently were onto the flatter expanse of land that lay ahead, a well-trodden road buried under a fresh blanket of snow. It was even nearly missed by Gandalf himself. Harry had requested frequent stories after their lessons. Bilbo had given him some useful tips on how to hold a sword so as not to injure himself or lose it easily, and where to place his feet. They had also been working on Harry's Elvish when Bilbo had heard he didn't speak it, Imagine. An elf who cannot speak his own language. Bilbo had shouted to the skies, the linguist sure that was one of the worst crimes aside from wasting a good meal. In those stories he had found out Gandalf was a wizard, an Ishtari. He was a very mysterious-sounding old man, Bilbo said. Even to his own friends he didn't release much of his inner thoughts. He never aged, Bilbo was sure, since when even Bilbo had been a child he had looked much the same. Oh, by the good green lady, the trolls. Are we here already? Bilbo turned Sparky. He had asked Harry, who wasn't very well versed in naming pets, what he wanted to name the poor pony. Bilbo didn't have the heart to question the poor boy after he had spent nearly a day contemplating a name, off the main path to a small beaten trail that went between a thicket of fallen trees where saplings had tried to sprout up around them. Trolls? Harry asked in a hushed voice, large eyes tarring away from his teacher to the surrounding area. Where? I don't see any. Oh, certainly not alive, my dear boy, chuckled Bilbo, squinting in the mid-noon light, but they are still most impressive to look upon. They entered a clearing and it only took Harry a second to see what Bilbo is talking about. What Bilbo originally had thought to just be mounds of large boulders in the distance was actually 3 stone trolls. Wow, he said in a breathless voice, truly impressed. Gracefully he hopped off Sparky and ran over to the large figures. They were real? They're dead? Oh yes, quite so, Bilbo said, a small smile on his face as he looked at the trolls with a feeling of nostalgia. It was all very frightening when we ran into them. Wait, Harry spun to him. You and your dwarves ran into them. You guys did this. Harry was practically trembling with excitement at the foot of one particularly nasty troll that was reaching out. He only came up to the thing's shin yet couldn't help but look up in awe at the gruesome figures. Oh yes, Bilbo said, sounding wistful, plenty used to telling young ones the tale of his adventures, though his heart gave a particularly painful squeeze at actually once again treading the path that he and his precious dwarven company had tread upon. It was all rather silly and probably completely avoidable if it had not been for those 2 boneheads. Sighing, he smiled down to the boy and pointed to the single mossy log that was left over from the temporary cage the trolls had made for the ponies. Keely and Philly had, somehow, managed to lose several of our ponies to the trolls. It may have been easier to say their names over the years, think of their once lively and youthful faces, but it still hurt. Bilbo was about to continue when he heard a snap off in the distance and he froze, eyes narrowing, and his hand touched his sword's hilt. Harry, come here, he hissed, his heart pounding. They had stayed to the main trail this whole trip, and thankfully it wasn't as dangerous as it had been when they were being hunted, so they had managed to avoid any serious skirmish. Bilbo kicked himself for becoming distracted and endangering the precious elfing. Harry quickly scampered over and in one fluid motion, that only an elf could achieve, scaled the pony and seated himself in front of Bilbo once again. Tightening his hands on Sparky's mane, Harry tried not to shiver in fear as he felt a similar dread to the one he had felt that first night he had arrived in Middle-earth. It's not yet nightfall, Bilbo was muttering, steering the pony back to the main road, his eyes to the tree line, glad they were near the break of the woods, but also dreading being an open plain for at least another hour's travel, perhaps less so if they pushed Sparky, though the pony was not inherently fast. What could? Before Bilbo could even finish his voicing, a snarling beast broke from the tree line, causing Harry to yelp and Sparky to work himself into a fright and bolt. Somehow Bilbo managed to hold onto the pony. Harry couldn't tell what it was, but all he had seen were much the same that he had seen that first night: yellow eyes, sharp teeth and claws. It didn't take much more to realize this was a warg, like in Bilbo's stories. They broke the tree line, Bilbo unable to calm Sparky, and made it out into the open field that, as in Bilbo's stories, they had managed to escape in. Harry hoped they could this time too. Around them various wargs and riders suddenly appeared from behind rocks and mounds of grass, and poor Sparky gave a frightened whinny trying to bolt away from the enclosing group. Unfortunately, the wargs were much too strong and fast for the poor pony, and it only took one warg to topple the shaggy beast over, causing Harry and Bilbo to go flying off. Thankfully Bilbo had been prepared and had rolled, pulling out his sword while doing so, his eyes wide and wild as he grabbed the fallen child who had not managed to land on his feet and ended up scraping his arms and chin on the rough rock. Sparky! Choked Harry with wide eyes as a warg took the pony's neck in its great jaws and with one fluid movement snapping it to the side, causing the animal to thrash for only a moment longer before stilling. Well, spoke one of the warg riders in broken common. Wah, is this we, avenue found, air? A fling? The word was said with a sneer. Avenue, eared of only one, Alfingda, has travelled so far, and, EISN, much o friend to orc. And, wah, do we, avenue, air? A child. The smirk slowly slid off his it was a male right? Face as his red eyes narrowed in on Harry, whom Bilbo quickly tried to tuck close to him more. Oh well, we do, avenue a treat, air. A nasty smile was on his face. He must have been the leader of the crude group. It seems as if the rumors are true. A wretched lil, elf spawn, has finally been born. And, after so long the precious lil thing is unprotected into wilds. The group was in a stir over this announcement and seemed to be closing in on them with barely contained excitement. The leader growled and swung his sword out to a large portion of the group. You can have the alfing, but I am getting the brat. Who said you get to be the only one to eat? I am, piped up one of the scrawny nasty creatures, and the two found that thankfully the attention had diverted from them to the two, a rift seeming to split between the group of orcs. I am the one who has banded us together and lead us to many great victories, the leader snarled as one of the others snapped at him, and he snapped right back. It is only my due pay. I has never seen one oath him before, drooled another. I just want a taste. He made to advance on the two, eyes never leaving Harry's before he found himself being kicked by their leader, toppling down. Suddenly they were snarling and swinging at each other, and Bilbo quickly pulled the frightened child along with him. Harry surprisingly snapped out of his frightened daze and quickly and quietly weaved out of the group, with the hobbit ignoring Sparky's dead form. Unfortunately, the wargs were not as easy to distract as their riders, and several snapped at them, growling, forcing them to stop not even a foot away from the scuffle. Bilbo held up his sword and Harry quickly picked up a nearby stick. It wouldn't do much, but there was no way he was going to go down without a fight. Look at him, cried one. They's be tryin' to get away. One of the smaller monsters scurried over to them, clawed hands reaching for Harry, when Bilbo sent his sword sailing through the air, and Harry tried to keep his lunge down as it neatly went through most of the beast's arm, not fully cutting it off so it dangled by torn skin and muscle as the foul creature howled in agony. One of the wargs snapped at Bilbo and sent a large set of claws to his back, causing the hobbit to cry out in pain, flying forward. Harry cried out and hit it over the nose with his stick, causing it to jump back, but only seemed to anger it instead of hurting it at all. It was about to jump to him when thwack, thwack, two arrows swiftly felled the beast and began to stick into the nearest enemies around them as tall armed warriors suddenly ended up in the scuffle and pandemonium broke out around Harry. But he couldn't find himself able to care as he collapsed next to the injured hobbit. Bilbo, he touched the older hobbit's shoulder, wincing at the gush of blood that oozed through the tattered cloth. Harry, Bilbo, he said, breathless. Yo, you need to run. Get to those archers. Those arrows. They're elvish in make. No, Bilbo, I need you. Please get up. Harry's eyes were wide as he watched the hobbit's eyes squeeze shut in pain as his breaths came out rapid and a sweat broke across his brow despite the chill. Harry shook in fear. Bilbo attempted a smile, even through the pain, as he tried to open now what was obviously heavy lids, the archers. His head dropped and his eyes fully closed. Harry sat up higher, ignoring the last thwack behind him in the distance as the orcs fell to their assailants. Bilbo, wake up. The curly head gave off a groan before falling silent, and he was still after that, and Harry felt his heart stop and breath catch, the hobbit not seeming fazed that he was laying in the freezing cold, turning the pure white of the snow a deep scarlet. Bilbo. He started shaking his shoulder a little, hoping to get a response from the older, tears gathering in his eyes. Wake up, oh no, please. Breathing deeply, he wiped away the tears at his eyes and held his breath, waiting for a response from the hobbit, but none came. Please no, don't do this. Bilbo. He curled up next to the side of the still hobbit, heart pounding wildly in his chest. He had lost Floy less than a week ago, with the promise of one day seeing him again, and of course the promise of frequent letters. But if Bilbo died, there would be no more lessons, and no more stories, and Harry knew all too well there would be no chance of ever seeing him again or even receiving a letter from him. This feeling of loss seemed to be even greater than losing Floy. Please, Bilbo, please. He shivered, snuggling onto the side of the hobbit more, careful of touching the oozing wounds. Wake up. Don't leave me alone. I don't know what to do. I can't help you, please tell me how to help you. A shadow fell over them and Harry faintly realized the fight around them had stopped and two of the riders had dismounted and were speaking fluidly in what Harry faintly recognized to be Elvish. His heart soared at the idea that the elves had found them, remembering Bilbo saying they had remarkable healing abilities. "Please," he shot up, "Bilbo's hurt, please help." One of the two shouted out to someone behind them who quickly dismounted and gingerly began attending to the hobbit. There were 6 in all, but Harry's teary gaze was zeroed in on the one crouched over Bilbo, raven hair and pointed features only slightly visible from under the helm. "Little one," spoke one of the two in front of him, and Harry was grateful that he could understand that much though what they said after he didn't catch. "I'm sorry," his voice trembled, I don't know what all you're saying." He sniffed, gaze going back to Bilbo. "Bilbo hasn't finished teaching me." His lip quivered. "Is Bilbo going to be all right?" Is he? Harry couldn't bring himself to say it. He heard it when referred to the parents that had been absent all his life. He didn't want to hint at the idea of Bilbo being dead. Didn't want to even fathom it. One of the two slowly kneeled down in front of Harry, pulling the boy's attention back to them. All of the elves, for that is what Harry knew they had to be, were extremely tall and willowy. The elf took off his helm, revealing dark brown hair and soft gray eyes, and the one next to him did the same a moment later, showing that his face mirrored the first one's. They both looked so amazed, looking down to Harry, as if words had been stolen from them at his mere presence. "Child," spoke the one on the left in such a soft voice, "I find myself a loss for words. Is Bilbo going to be all right?" He started shaking and feared his knees would give way soon if they didn't answer him. The one he was addressing looked to the healer elf, who nodded and responded in their language. Turning back to Harry, he nodded, "Bilbo shall be fine. Which settles my heart, as for he is a dear friend of my father's. But my heart is still uneasy. Where are your parents? What are you doing here?" Harry trembled, looking from one to the other before he couldn't take it anymore. The days of traveling in the cold, of almost losing Bilbo, having to say farewell to Balin and Floy, being transported to this world looking completely unlike himself. Flinging himself forward, he was glad the first twin accepted him with strong toned arms automatically wrapping around him in a warming hug as sobs began to wreck his body. They were not thick and covered in furs like Floy's, but the warmth and secure feeling was there still. Harry couldn't find the strength to form words, much less explain anything to the elf, and he just continued to sob until he fell into a fast and fitful sleep, the events of the past couple months too much for him to take any longer. "Elrohir," Elladan whispered as he took of his silver-gray cloak and wrapped it around the unconscious elfin, "this child." "I know, brother." Elrohir touched the child's soft cheek, finally finding his voice, shocked at the fact an elfing would be out in the wilds, that an elfing was even born. Whenever there was a birth, the elves would celebrate for many years between the kingdoms, so rare and precious their children were. Why had they not heard of a child being born? Why was he not with his parents, dressed in what seemed to mostly be dwarven garb, traveling with the hobbit? Elladan stood, heart weeping and eyes soft. "We must bring him to father. I have patched up the hobbit as best as I can for now." They turned to an auburn short-haired female elf, Burial, as her brunette mother, Amethael, who cradled the child in her arms much like a child, and brunette brother Hitchin approached. The blue-eyed family all looked unbelieving to the child in Elladan's arms. "Is he truly?" Hitchin's voice faltered. The only one who had not dismounted his steed, Glorfindel, finally spoke. "We must go. Before more orcs come and endanger them any farther. We shall head back and inform of the suspicious orc activity so close to our borders." Nodding, the twin princes mounted their horses with ease, as did the warrior family, and they all turned and headed back home. Young Harry lay curled up, snuggled in Elladan's arms, and he held the child close, hardly able to keep his gaze from the strange babe with black hair and the most striking green eyes in all of Middle-earth. Chapter End Notes. Author notes. I apologize, I have not written for a while. This note will be political. The recent violence and events happening across the U.S. and the support for so much violence on both sides of this is disheartening, draining, and wrong. I know many people are angry, hurt and scared. But pressing to do the same to people who have done nothing to you only causes them to feel the same. Attacking the innocent and destroying their lives just causes more pain, and solves nothing. It weakens the American people. Saying that historically that one group had done this to the other, doesn't make it right to do it to the first group now. The focus, if any violence need be done, should be to those who cause the problems and who are in need of reform. Not people in the hospital, not children in their homes, and not the officers who try to help. Not people protecting their bushiness, not old ladies in wheelchairs trying to shop. I know many do not share my sentiments, but instead of saying no cops lives matter and rioting and breaking into businesses, beating people for the color of their skin, why don't we use that power you have displayed for a positive change? There are still innocent children being detained by U.S. Border Patrol, kept away from their parents. There are still people who have billions of offshore dollars they hoard, draining our country's wealth. If you can break into a bank, you could surely use the same power and measure to storm those prisons and allow their innocent children free, reunite fractured families. If you can burn towns down and bring the attention of the nation to you, you surely can burn down mansions, destroy the rich, focus on congressional members. I do not like violence, but I do realize it is at times necessary to overcome the evils of the world. It should just never be used on those innocent and weak. I'm sorry that this political, but it needs to be said. I am far away from any rioting, but it still hurts my heart to see my fellow Americans harming each other so for being black or for being white. It saddens me I see so many take advantage of a tragedy. I do not know when I next will update. I will soon be flying down to work on an ambulance unit for a few months. It may keep me rather busy, and being away from home writing may not be as frequent, however that isn't much. I know. I'm sorry. Thank you for all for reading my stories and supporting the writing that keeps me going. 7 Chapter 7 There had been a time in his early tween years when Bilbo had fallen into the Brandywine River and, somehow, managed to survive. He had hit his head, had been knocked unconscious for several days, and when he had awoken it had been with a pounding ache that settled across his brow and throughout his body from both the injury and fever. He felt much the same now. Pulling himself from sleep, he now sluggishly thought of that time after the Brandywine River and of how odd of him to remember such a thing. His eyes felt heavy, mouth dry, and his arms moved as if they were weighted when he lifted one to touch his once again pounding head. At his groan of pain there was a shuffle off to his side, but he couldn't find it in him to care. The bed he was in was so comfortable, and it was a welcome idea to let himself slip back to a painless sleep. What had happened? His whole body ached much like the days of his membership to Thorne's company, and his side burned and itched much like a healing wound. Eyes shooting open, Bilbo gasped, remembering what exactly had occurred before he lost consciousness. The light of the evening sun may have been dim, but it was enough for Bilbo to hiss in pain and squeeze his eyes shut, trying to stop his shaking and regulate his breathing. Sir Malin, a soft voice whispered, and Bilbo felt the tension in his shoulders leave as a soft hand touched his forehead, dispersing the pinch at his brow. Elves. He was with the elves. Then did that mean? Harry, his voice was a hoarse rasp, and he began to cough. Gentle hands guided him into a sitting position and assisted him in slowly drinking some water. Once he was laying again, and he felt feverish and already exhausted, the voice whispered to him, "Harry is fine and well. Many thanks and praise to you for having protected someone so precious." At that Bilbo allowed himself to fall into another sleep, hoping next time he woke the aches and pains were gone, and there was a smiling green-eyed boy by his side. Elrond finished Bilbo's bandages, pleased with how the wound was healing, and glad that this time he woke lucid, signifying just how much his fever had went down and how well his recovery was going. The soft patter of feet coming to the door signified Harry, arriving as he did after every evening meal. Though now he frequently went by Calamorn, as for his eyes were the most green mysterious color in all of Middle-earth, and he was a true treasure among their people. "Lord Elrond," Harry's bell voice rung in the room as he slowed at the door, cheeks red with his jog to the healing rooms, and Elrond turned to see the smile slip off Harry's face when the boy spotted the bandages on the table. "He is fine, young one," Elrond soothed, and large green eyes flicked up to his own, smile slowly coming back shyly. "I was just changing his bandages. It is necessary the wound breaths, and the bandages are clean so he can fight off any infection." Harry nodded, and made his way over gracefully as any elfing. Not that elves were not light and quick on their feet as children, mind you, but Elrond could not chase away the large smile that took over his face unwillingly when he noticed how clumsy the boy could be at times. The floor was absolutely smooth and clean, and yet he still managed to stumble halfway. He even woke for a brief moment. Elrond continued when the boy reached the hobbit's side. "He asked if you were well." Does that mean he is going to be out of bed soon? Again those large green eyes went from Bilbo to Elrond, curious and hopeful. Elrond shook his head. I do believe he has quite some time to be in this bed, though he is healing fast for a mere halfling. The last part was murmured, a curious thought the elven lord was mulling over, but Harry quickly snapped his constant rebuttal to the frequent title, Hobbit. He isn't half of anything. Lord Elrond looked up to the boy who had warmed up to them the past 3 weeks, standing stubborn at the other end of Bilbo's bed, arms crossed, determination radiating from him as he began to puff out his cheeks. Yes, you were quite right, Harry. Elrond smiled and bowed slightly. My mistake. I know all too well of Bilbo's great deeds, and surely many of Middle-earth cannot do even half the same. Harry nodded, pacified, and looked back down to the hobbit, laying a hand gently onto the curly head, stoking the strands, watching them bounce from his finger back in place. Did you enjoy dinner? Nodding, Harry began to talk as Elrond cleaned his work area. Oh yes, very much, thank you. Elladan shot a buck on watch yesterday and they brought it back in time for the cooks to make it earlier. He may say he is the one who felled the buck, but only for it was I who not only spotted it but redirected it into his path. Elrohir strode into the room, a grin across his face, and Elrond felt his heart lighten. After what had happened to their mother, it was rare for his boys to smile, much less be so light-hearted so often. But with the arrival of Harry, who had warmed up to them slowly over the past few weeks, and even though he was still shy and still quiet at times, he had begun to settle into a routine. Harry smiled up at Elrohir. Elladan said that you would be unable to shoot even an already downed buck, and it would always be his bow to keep you both fed on travels. Oh, does he now? Elrohir scooped the boy, who giggled and began tickling him mercilessly. And what have I told you about believing my devious twin? BBU, but Harry gasped in between peals of bell-like laughter. He sounded so convincing. Calm you two, admonished Elrond lightly, looking to Elrohir, no heat behind his stern gaze. This is a healing room and I have a patient that needs his rest. Even as he said this, the feverish hobbit did not stir. Harry silenced right away and Elrohir nodded. Sorry, father. I hope he can get up soon. I wanted to show him what Elrohir taught me yesterday. Harry was referring to the fact the past few days the twins had agreed to teach him swordplay and other means of self-defense. Even though he were young, elves were not unknown for their place on Middle-earth as warriors. Elrohir tucked the boy to his side, rubbing his face against the black glossy hair that was mostly down besides a small braid hanging down the right side of his face. You will. Think about it this way, you will be able to teach him quite a few moves once he is up the longer you train. Harry smiled gently up to the twin and nodded, humming. There you are. The group looked up to Arwen, who was smiling gently as she crossed her arms, giving a mock stern look to the emerald-eyed boy who ducked out of Elrohir's embrace with a squeak, quickly hiding behind Elrond's robes. She walked forward, raising a delicate brow. You told me earlier this morning, so long as I put off your lessons until later so you could practice the sword with Elladan and Elrohir, that you would be sure to finish them. Yet you have managed to dodge me all day. But you didn't necessarily specify when later was. Nor did I. Harry peeked around, hopeful eyes looking up to the Arwen as she fought a smile from her face. I believe, she began, giving up fighting off the grin that broke across her face, and she turned sparkling eyes to her father, that my Ada has told me that my brothers said much the same. It makes one wonder if they could perhaps be influencing you in a way that I would find inadvisable. She trailed off, turning her eyes to said sibling, who grinned, scratching the back of his head. Let's not be too hard on the young one, he chuckled. After all, he is quite clever. Too clever, it would seem, laughed Elrond, putting a hand to the small child's head and kneeling down. Go finish your lessons with Arwen, or I fear my daughter may take away all manners of swordplay until you are caught up on your own language, young one. Harry sighed but didn't argue, which was much like him in most matters. Giving a nod, the child made his way over to Arwen, who took his hand with a gentle smile of her own. Harry's disappointed disposition cleared away when Elrond was pretty sure his daughter whispered something about sweets as a reward for her good student, and suddenly there was a pep in the young one's step. They made their way out the door, father and son watching, left in deep thought. He is amazing, murmured Elrohir, and Elrond didn't have to look to know that there was a wistful look on his son's face. It was true. The day that Harry had been brought to him, scared and secluded, sobbing for Bilbo to wake up, Elrond had been shocked to see the young one. From that day on they had nurtured and done all in their power to pull Harry out of his shell. And like most young ones his age, He thankfully bounced back and begun to open up to them. He didn't speak of his past, or of any family. He didn't say anything of what had happened other than friends had considered Bilbo a trustworthy caretaker to deliver him to the elves. It concerned Elrond that Harry didn't wish to share whom exactly had given him to Bilbo, or to whom had raised him. From what Harry did share, it had been two separate parties. And it was the whom had raised him that Elrond was most interested in wiggling out of the young one. As the same with every other elf, surely in all of the last homely house, the Greenwood, and Lothlorien, as for a day after he had been brought and Bilbo had been deemed stable, Elrond was sure to send messengers to both kingdoms. "Good night, Ada," his son spoke, and Elrond shook from his deep thoughts. He nodded his head in reply, mind still addled by the questions surrounding the young boy. Leisurely he walked out to the balconies that overlooked the gardens outside the Health Wing and watched the last rays of light disperse from the horizon and stars to litter the sky. Closing his eyes, he allowed the memory of the boy's arrival to fill his mind. My Lord Elrond, the memory of how Lindar came to him, eyes wide and body singing with emotion that he hadn't seen the other display in least a few hundred years. Elrond stood curious as to what could bring on such a display, and for a moment he worried of his sons whom had returned early from their hunt. Quickly he dismissed the council gathered with an apology. He knew it must have been urgent had Lindar came to disrupt the meeting they had been having. Walking with the exceptionally musical elf, Elrond looked to the brunette, who quickly began to speak quietly but with no less enthusiasm. My Lord Elrond, your sons have returned unharmed as well as the rest of the hunting party, but they bring with them one injured, Bilbo Baggins, and Elrond continued his pace, hastened at the news that the great elf friend Bilbo Baggins was injured, but sent an inquiring quirk of his brow to the other elf as to what could possibly be more urgent than that. Bilbo had seemed so eager to return home, his soul finding little calm in Rivendell's halls as it once had. Elrond's heart ached for the hobbit, as for he knew the pain of loss. He brings with him, uninjured, an elfling. It was as if the world had slowed around Elrond from the impossible news. He had quickly made it to the healing rooms, to where his daughter and several other elves already were gathered, some attending to Bilbo, and some such as his children were calming a small quivering bundle that refused to stop gripping on to Elladan, and he sobbed great heart-wrenching sobs begging for Bilbo to stop bleeding and for him to not die. Upon his entrance, Glorfindel had made his way to where he had been monitoring the child that was with Elrond's children and the hobbit who was being tended to by Berial and Amithiel. The blade was poisoned, Berial stated as Elrond pulled his interest to the injured hobbit. No matter how much he wished to console the child, he would never leave a patient, especially a friend such as Bilbo Baggins, unaided. By what I do not know, it seems as if it is eating away at him. The wound was gruesome. The original strike was clear, a clean cut making it from one side to the other. The depth and placing of the wound normally would not make for such worry with attention, but the fact that the top few layers of skin seemed to have already peeled away and were beginning to pus made Elrond's brow crease. A sob broke out behind him, muffled by his son's shoulder. Take him to your rooms. He knew his voice must sound cold, but to be a proper healer he needed to be calm. No, please, sobbed the stuffy-nosed elf, and their eyes met. Even red-rimmed and puffy, this child's eyes were extraordinary and soul-piercing as he looked to Elrond, pleading, lip quivering, body shaking. The healing process is long and difficult, child. Elrond spoke evenly. I will do much better in caring for dear Bilbo with as few in the room as possible. With deep shuddering breaths the boy looked to him one long moment, before glancing to the others in the room and back to him. Slowly, he sniffed and nodded, wrapping his arms around Elladan's neck when the elf stood. He had watched them go from the corner of his eye, the boy's gaze never leaving him with the hobbit. For hours he worked on Bilbo with Amithiel and Berial. The poison was hard to identify, surely one he had not come across ever before, and it was very corrosive, eating away at Bilbo's flesh, muscle, and right when they found something to fight it, it had begun to gnaw away at a bone. Which was why now it was taking Bilbo so very long to recover from it. The poison thankfully had not made its way to his inner organs, but the damage it had done had sent his whole body into a shutdown mode, and gave him a terrible fever. Elrond felt they were over the brunt of the healing. He was amazed the hobbit's wound seemed to recovering so well to such a poison as it were, but he felt that his attention should be focused entirely to the healing of their named elf friend. Elrond turned from the dark mountains with a sigh, looking to the still figure on the bed, ready for another long night of monitoring. Harry sat with Arwen in his room, which was spacious and neat with a bed table and dresser all light wood and earthy tones, to where they had taken his studies to as she explained words and rules of the elven language. Her language. His people's language. It still was a lot to take in even though he had been in Middle-earth for several months now. Gazing out the window to the inky moonless sky, he thought about England. About number 4 Privet Drive tucked neatly away with all the other houses, with the Dursleys finally rid of their nuance, able to finally go on with their lives without him. He felt a tug at his heart and a breath catch at his throat, and even though there was a magical fire in his room to heat it, he suddenly felt cold and alone. All anyone had done for him, ever since arriving to Middle-earth, from the dwarves to Bilbo and now the elves, was care for and nurture him, to accept him, and become close. But how long until they knew how truly useless he was? How worthless? How undeserving of this kindness he was? Would he be forced back out into the wilds to fend for himself? Or perhaps shoved down to where there were surely some type of dungeons? He tried so hard at the Dursleys to please them, to have his love returned. Yet it never was. The memories were so fresh, still, that no matter how many good ones were being created in this new land, with these new people, dwarves, hobbits, elves alike, it wouldn't erase that deep twist of fear and self-hatred that lead him to times of unrest when all was well. There was a burning behind his eyes and he blinked them quickly to fight any tears that gathered. Harry, Arwen's soft voice lilted concern suddenly very near his side, is all well, child? Ye. The lie caught in his throat when his eyes met hers and suddenly the tightness in his chest doubled and a knot twisted in his throat. He quickly blinked his eyes but his vision began to swim regardless. For some reason, lying to elves seemed near impossible. She quickly enveloped him in a hug. The elves had proved to be a very affectionate peoples when it came to him and smoothed his hair down. Tell me what troubles you, Poicaire, she said, ending with the endearment she often used when he became closed off to the ones around him. Elves were also a very open people with their thoughts and emotions, or at least among their own kind. Harry realized which was opposite from what he had heard from the dwarves. And he was told it was much easier to live thousands of years doing so. Trying to be like his people, reminding himself they were his people and he should at least try to open up, which was so often asked of him, he took a shuddering breath. I'm sorry, I just... His young mind tried to find words to explain his fears and concerns, tried hard to pull forth explanations of how the Durlseys treated him and made him feel. He grasped for a way to open up explanations of scars that no longer hurt but still bore into his memories of lessons and punishment, of words of hate and that constant urge and yearning to be loved. He wished he could say he was afraid of not being useful, of performing poorly, or never being enough. What if another elf was born, and they would fall in love with them more? What if after what if blurred through his mind at her inquiry, leaving him breathless? All this brought feelings of disgust and guilt for some reason. So the best he could do was to ask, you wouldn't ever bore of me, would you, Arwen? He looked up, wide eyes clenching his hands onto the green tunic he had been fitted in. Arwen blinked, obviously a bit surprised by the question. Why, my dear, she said, brows creasing, I would never imagine it, not in any lifetime. And Elladan and Elrohir, Lord Elrond? Bilbo? Everyone? His lip began to quiver and a fresh wave of tears gathered in his eyes. See, 'cause I know. He snapped, his jaw shut, lip quivering. How could he tell her? What could he say? The words, waste of space, echoed through his head. 0. No, only, she said as she gently pushed his chin up so they could make eye contact, that during the time you have been here, you have made your way into our hearts. Know that there is love, and no matter what the future may hold, that love is priceless and irreplaceable. It will never be something we throw aside. Love is the most precious of treasures. He sniffed and looked to the side, rubbing his nose with the back of the green tunic he wore. I just... Looking up to her, he felt a lump in his throat but swallowed it down with the need to relay his feelings, to say what had been on his mind for the months of travel with the dwarves, with Bilbo, and now with the elves. But all he managed was, I never had this before. I don't want to lose. The words were eaten up by dark feelings again, and he waved his hands around, trying hard to find some sort of way to express to her. And you never will. Arwen pushed away the last of the tears from his soft, plump cheeks. He had finally gained some weight and they had lost their hollowed look that came from months of being on the road. We're your family, and that is never going to change. Despite the fact the tears began to flow more freely, and he was now sobbing openly, Harry could honestly say he had never felt happier in his life. Chapter 8 Chapter Summary. This is rather short, but I wanted to post something up so I cut it short before my intended chapter ending. I hope you still enjoy, as always, please R+R, thanks. The days rolled by and with them so did the ease in which Harry found himself able to find harmony with the elves and with it a sort of piece of himself unwinding that he had not realized had been bound inside his heart until it finally released. It was as if everything from waking to walking and all activities he did to sleeping, all were done without an added weight, without something always holding him. Only a week after he had sobbed his fears out to Arwen, Bilbo was finally well enough to stay awake for periods of time, and Harry found himself lighter still because of it. He spent long periods of time with the hobbit who smiled and would listen to all Harry had to say, and when Harry found that words were hard to come by, Bilbo filled the silence easily with his many tales that Harry had missed hearing. At times Harry would miss Floyd greatly, wondering how the dwarf was holding up, and dreaming of visiting the other in his mines of gold and riches. Bilbo would do his best to fill the void left by the dwarf, and the elves did as well. All the love and attention was new to Harry, but not fully unwelcome, even if at times he found he had to distance himself to even be able to process the emotions and thoughts that stemmed from so much attention. With Bilbo's waking also came the knowledge that dwarves had not only saved Harry, but kept him well for a period of time before bringing him to the Shire. The elves seemed unsure of how to take this, until finally settling into a sort of acceptance and graceful thanks. Elrond stating that if any dwarf of that company wished to stay, they would be welcome with open arms and expressed gratitude. More days passed, and the dusting of snow that had blanketed the earth became a thick covering that hid any remainder from fall. Far be it like the winters back in his cupboard at Privet Drive, where the sky seemed bleak and the crunch of snow uninviting while his cupboard let in a chill. The world seemed to glow as the sun kissed the new fluff of fallen snow and the crisp air brought an energy in the young boy. Harry had proven a rather agreeable student in both his studies of geography, history and language, and his sword skills had improved greatly along with the newfound ability of being a natural archer, and so he would quickly find free time around his studies and visiting Bilbo, who now held up healing in his own room. This led to many exploring expeditions around Rivendell, there never seeming to be a lack of new places to investigate. The elves humored the boy, watching him closely as he searched the last homely house, though he quickly made a game of trying to evade their knowing gaze and sneak about unnoticed to see how long it would take them to find him. This is precisely what Harry found himself wishing to do one crisp winter morning. Harry had quickly come to learn that even the calendar months and years were different to the elves. He had learned of Yen, the 144-year reckoning period, and they tended to divide their year not into 12-month periods, which he found was common for that of men and hobbits, but instead into 6. They were currently in Ryu, which he was told lasted 72 days. The elves had found it rather amusing he found this to be such a long month, and Bilbo had given him comfort of the Shire calendar, saying they were well into Blamath, and should be celebrating by well eating and preparing for Foryule. Harry then translated to the elves his knowledge of months, and he guessed they were in mid-November. So it was on a crisp mid-Blamath, or not so far into Ryu, that Harry found himself waking, itching for some adventure and mischief. He had been promised the day free of lessons, and the clear skies and advancing sun were promising for a day perfect for freedom. Quickly switching into a tunic and leggings, he jumped into his warm overcoat and boots, wiggling into a pair of warm gloves, pausing at the door for only a moment to consider throwing on the warm winter pants over his leggings before scampering off to Bilbo's rooms to see him prior to his explorations. After a cheerful welcome into the room, Harry opened the door to see Bilbo propped up by pillows, book in hand, and looking better than he ever had. "Good morning, my dear boy." The cheerful hobbit sat the book down and grinned as the boy bounded to the bed, giving great care to Bilbo's still healing wounds and hugging him. "And what are we up to today, him?" "Arwen already said my writing is well enough that a day's break is well deserved," Harry defended before Bilbo could assume he was skipping lessons. Bilbo chucked and smoothed down the tangled mess of hair. "I see that you are eager to take advantage. Your hair looks untouched by all but the mess the pillow made of it, and I worry you have forgotten breakfast, most important meal before adventuring, you know." Harry smoothed down the stray strands that insisted on sticking in odd directions and rolled his eyes with a grin. "Oh Bilbo, what a hobbit thing to say." "Ah, but I do believe that this is a universal belief between all races," Bilbo grinned. "Perhaps run to the kitchens and grab a bite before running off, will you? Then you can explore to your heart's content. Just be sure to tell me all about what you find before you head off to bed." At Harry's exasperated look, Bilbo gave one more go. "You can find something quick, mind you, and able to take with you on your adventure. Mind all ventures need a well-planned food stores, lest you not run into any good mushrooms in the woods." Harry had found out over time that for some odd reason hobbits were very much so into mushrooms. He found it best not to question it. "Fie nay, Uncle Bilbo, I will go eat something. Would you like me to grab you anything as well?" Bilbo chuckled. "Oh no, my dear boy, just be sure to eat well and tell me of all your adventures over dinner." Harry nodded, smiling brightly before giving Bilbo a peck on the cheek and running off to the kitchens, keeping to his promise. It was near the kitchens he heard a murmur of voices that perked his pointed ears, and he slowed as he neared the corner, not exactly meaning to eavesdrop, but something kept him from announcing himself earlier. "They increase in number and press at the border. None has made any serious threat." It was Elladan. "Be sure to maintain vigilance despite this," Glorfindel's voice responded. "There is reason for their sudden energy and uprise in numbers." "Yes, of course, it was Arwen. We will only be a few days' times. The border hasn't weakened any despite the goblins." Strange though, Glorfindel sounded lost in thought, that the goblins have left their caves in such times. All seems to be at peace, that I wonder what moved them. The three silenced, so Harry took the opportunity to peek his head around the corner and see their backs to him as they stood in thought, Arwen and Elladan dressed for travel. Curiosity too strong, Harry quickly made his way to the trio. "Elladan." The three looked up to the smiling boy whose eyes were full of question. "Are you going out on a hunt?" He eyed the sword at the elf's hip before his eyes moved to Arwen, who was dressed for travel much like her brother, with Hadifong in obvious preparation for a journey. Elladan grinned and swept the boy up, ruffling his already too messy hair. "Well, look at this early bird. No lessons today, yet still up at dawn. He is far more diligent than you, dear brother." Arwen smiled while smoothing the dark locks her brother had ruffled. "And in answer to your question, dear Harry, no, we are not hunting. We are doing checks of our borders, to ensure nothing has weakened them." Harry's smile faltered at these words and he looked between the three. "You mean like orcs and other monsters that are in the dark?" They had heard about Harry's injury to his leg, and all had been pleased that it had fully healed with time and care between the dwarves and hobbit. It had become more apparent when the story was brought up in explanation of Harry's first discovery, and Harry, still unwilling to fully divulge, he had come from a place not of Middle-earth. The fact that Harry feared the dark and sometimes feared monsters in its shadows came about. Rivendell always seemed to have a light in it, even with the dark somehow, but after hearing this, Harry had been gifted special glowing plants that grew in his room in an illuminating green, the soft color lulling him to sleep every night. Despite being embarrassed over his admitted fears, he could not look down on the gifts that were more than welcome in his lonely room. "Yes, to ensure they do not come here, where it is safe for you, young Calamoran," Glorfindel emphasized this, knowing all too well the rise of fear that came with past traumas. Harry frowned and nodded before looking between the other two. "But you will be careful, right? And be back soon. When will you return? Tonight? For dinner?" "Oh, Calamoran, fear not. No, tonight we shall not return tonight, but in several days' time. It is not too long, but we are needing to check on several areas. We shall be safe," Arwen promised, smile pulling at her lips. "After all, you still need to finish your lessons." Harry gave an exaggerated groan of pain, flopping onto Elladan's shoulder, crying into it, voice muffled. "Torture? I knew it. Auntie enjoys torture." They all laughed and he sat up, face twisted in a firm defiance. "Too many books. She always wants to read when it's so pretty out, we could be playing." This made the group laugh even more, and Harry rolled his eyes, shaking his head. "Oh dear Calamoran," laughed Elladan, "if you fear my sister's wrath, you should have seen." A pained look overtook his face and all three sobered as he continued softly, "You should have seen our mother. A force to be reckoned with, I assure you. You never would have skipped a single lesson." Harry looked to the three adults, seeing the sadness that overtook them and feeling uncomfortable by the sudden mood shift. "Okay, fine, he said, wanting the three to return their lighter demeanors. "I will be eagerly awaiting my boring lessons." Elladan gave him a hug and kiss on the cheek. Arwen followed suit as Glorfindel smiled angelically and patted his head. "What were you up to today, young one?" the golden-haired elf asked. Harry grinned, simply responding, "Exploring." Elladan cackled, chiming in, "More like up to no good. The past couple days our young Harry has been seen sneaking about trying to slip in and out unnoticed, causing all sorts of mischief for our poor father. I don't, the youth protested, widening his eyes innocently, and the adults all chuckled at that again. Well, I am certain you were off to the kitchens, Glorfindel observed, stepping aside and waving his arm down the hall. Do not let us hinder your progress. Before he scurried down the hall, Eladin leaned in. If you go past the northern library, there is a secret garden my brother and I had found years before. Perhaps you can spy it as well, if you are observant enough. Harry nodded, smiling, and ran down the hall to the kitchens, imagining finding a secret garden filled with all sorts of wonder. Chapter 9 Chapter Summary. Harry attempts to fill his free time up, though as an only child in Rivendell, the task seems quite difficult. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Harry's trip to the kitchens, of course, was well met with the elves that had busied themselves the tasks of feeding those who dined in the hall. Seeing Harry, cheeks flushed with energy and eyes sparkling, they were more than happy to indulge his appetite and smile and nod to his plans for the day. I am headed on an adventure, he stated sternly, trying to emulate Glorfindel with an air of finality and severity, and I plan to be gone for a long time, perhaps until supper even. Oh well, in that case, young Harry, take some of these to tide you until then, Keenan, a brunette soft-spoken elf, said with a mock-grave air, not fighting the smile down from his lips. As Keenan passed a sack of still warm biscuits with clotted cream to them, another elf Harry couldn't remember the name to, but always loved her shorter stature, for the elves that was, and pale blue eyes came up and passed him a couple sweets, and this, Calamorn, to energize you until dessert. His eyes sparkled and the kitchen elves giggled, some chuckling they would surely be in trouble for giving him sweets so early in the day. But the treat was already in hand, and Harry was going to ensure it wouldn't last long. After eating his fill, and thanking the Rivendell elves, he secured his coat about him once again, grabbed his spoils and made off to the northern library, the thought of the hidden garden the twins had discovered once in his thoughts. As he scampered through the halls, he allowed himself to ponder his name. Harry had never been anything of great importance to him back home, no, but he wasn't sure how he felt when the elves had renamed him Calamorn, and at times they would call him one or the other. He wasn't sure how to broach the subject, not wanting to upset his new family, or make them feel they could no longer act as freely with him. But it confused him, at times, having two names, when back home he had always been Harry, or more often Boy. He slowed, backtracking that thought process in realization, family. Yes. The elves in Rivendell had become a sort of family to him, and his heart swelled with feeling. He finally had what he had always dreamed, prayed, and begged for. A family. People who loved him. Those who could celebrate holidays with him. Who would go on outings with him. Listen to him and keep him feeling safe. Even beyond the elves, Bilbo was like a form of family, and Floy. He stopped suddenly, heart twisting so unexpectedly and so violently he felt at a loss for breath. Attempting a few slow, shaky breaths, he put his hand in his pocket, thumbing the still warm stone that always stayed with him, as he fought back tears. He could have wanted for nothing here in Rivendell. The elves provided for him and amazed him how much they loved and cared for him so easily. But the memory of being lulled to sleep by Floy's large arms, his rough hands rubbing circles into his back as his beard scratched the top of his forehead. Stories came in the form of deep rumbling words, and the other's feelings burning through with them. Trying to hold back a sob, Harry angrily wiped his cheeks. He would be ready to show how much he had practiced his sword and bow for when Floy would return to him. Perhaps, even, go to the mines of Moria once Floy and Balin had made them safe enough to visit. Breathing shakily, Harry turned, away from the north towers and off to the east. He wasn't certain where he was headed, but his heart no longer yearned to discover the secret garden. His heart yearned for Floy, and since the one he wanted was not here, he decided that improving his skills would be a better use of his time. Equals 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 equals. Many of the elves that Harry normally sought out for training were not present, and soon he found many had gone to do scouting missions. Some, he was informed, would return by late that evening, only checking the lands nearest to Rivendell, while many, such as the twins, would be gone for around a week's time. This news depressed Harry even more and put his mood so sour he was no longer hungry for the sweets he had been granted or for swordplay. He smiled and thanked the elves he had spoken to despite himself, and made his way subdued along the corridors wishing for company yet not sure where to obtain it. At this he became painfully aware, he was not only the only child in Rivendell, but from what he had been informed the only known elfing in all the elven kingdoms. This suddenly made him feel even smaller than he had before, and empty in a different way he wasn't sure how to name. At Privet Doctor he may not have had any close friends. The Dursleys would never allow a child that spoke with Harry to visit after all, but he had made out in some ways at school. Children he would chat with, others he would play various games with at times. When it came to bullying it was frequent, yes, but there was a sense of unity that came being surrounded by others your age. A place of being, even if it were not always enjoyable. So, with only elves that he did not know around, and not wishing to bother Elrond whom had seemed very busy the past few days, and Bilbo who was still recovering and would surely ask why he hadn't wanted to adventure, he sought out solitude. It seemed this was an easier task to perform when many of the sentries and guards were out patrolling the vast expanse of land that made up the last homely house. The halls of the last homely house were not quite as full as they generally were, and the elves he did pass would acknowledge him but allow his meandering go uninterrupted. Harry soon found himself past the walls of his new home, and in a less trekked area of the grounds. He started when he realized he had been walking without minding where he was going. So absorbed into his thoughts he had not noticed he had wormed his way into a seemingly abandoned area. All hurt feelings and depression became fleeting at the sight of ruins. Stone in places that had not been repaired, what seemed to have been old living quarters perhaps lay in ruin and the grand walls that encircled them barely crumbled, a hole just a little smaller than Harry himself scarcely visible from under a fallen statue. Harry stood for a moment, releasing a breath he had not realized was being held. Wonder filled his eyes as he slowly approached the fallen statue, the worn smooth face half gone but familiar in a way that drew in him. As he approached, a movement in the distance caught his eye and made his heart race. Pausing with his foot barely set into the untouched snow, Harry stared wide-eyed at the opening in the large wall. Hello, he called, stomach knotted, eyes wide. At no response, nor no further movement, he set his foot more firmly in the snow, barely edging himself forward as he did so. Hello? Is anyone there? There was a slight scuffle of noise on the far side of the wall and he stopped his advancement. His mind spun with the memories of the horrid goblins from when he had first arrived and how they had poured from the tree line. He shuddered, settling his weight on the foot farthest from the now very frightening hole, with its unknown assailant hidden within shadow just beyond. He had not known danger since entering Rivendell, but the knowledge that it always lay beyond the walls and in the wilds became sharp in his mind. He didn't turn around, but began backing away, no longer intrigued by the ruins nor the hole. Another scuffle and what sounded to be a growl, and he gasped, twisting away to run, slipping on snow and scraping his hand and ripping his glove on a hidden board of broken wood under the snow as he scrambled to run when hearing something approach. Yelping, words of help dying on his lips as he attempted to run away, catching a glimpse of fur and fangs. A warg. It was a stray warg. How did one make it so close to the last homely house? Was not every available elf scouting the surrounding grounds and lands that encompassed Rivendell? He didn't have time for questions such as these, for he was trying to figure out where in the grounds he was while still running. Having stumbled upon the ruin after walking for some time lost in thought, he realized the ruin was now a maze, and outside the main walls of Rivendell which seemed now so far off. He had run further into the remains of the covered ruin, and as such his pursuer followed close as he scrambled through hidden debris and blocked pathways. Harry was agile and quick, this coming in handy to run as the pursuer far larger than he struggled to make its way through fallen walls and narrow passages. He heard the pant of the beast nearing him, and with a yelp he dashed under the archway of one of the ruined buildings. That structure stood bare and skeletal, before feeling the ground beneath his feet give way. He was sure he had screamed. He couldn't remember it, but he was pretty sure of the scream. The only thing he knew for certain was he had twisted as he fell, attempted to lay purchase on solid ground. And the last thing he saw was a large beast whose gray fur stood dark against the white snow, and fangs glistened in the rising sun. Chapter endnotes short and a bit clipped, but I have had a scene in my head, played out a few different ways, and we are nearing this. I am not fully prepared to write it out yet, as for I have been ramping up for it for a few chapters now, and am excited to be near writing it. I also worry many will dislike the freedom I took with this. I hope this is not the case and all of you whom have been waiting eagerly enjoyed. Please review and let me know what you think. Thank you. Chapter 10 Chapter Notes. I apologize that I am so slow to update, and while this does nothing to answer any questions and probably creates more than enough, I can assure you that a lot will be answered next chapter. I myself was writing an exhausted Harry as I myself was fighting off sleep. I may need to edit this again next I am on, but I hope that you all enjoy and I hope it isn't too terrible. I feel I rushed the events in this chapter more than I normally would. As always, please enjoy and let me know what you think. Chapter 10 Harry groaned as he awoke, cold and confused, laying on a small pile of snow and broken pieces of woodboards. What happened? The memory of the ward chasing him came back to him sharply, and he sat up gasping, blinking eyes in the hazy darkness that encircled him. The pounding in his chest slowed to a bearable speed after a few moments of silence and observation, but the view of his surroundings, no matter how void of the ward, did nothing to calm his heart. He wasn't one for distance, but the height he had fallen from was too far to scale. The opening from which dim golden light shone through, barely touching him where he sat on the wet dirty floor. He eyed the surrounding curiously, seeing statues that stood over him, crumbling and forgotten much like the hall he was in. After a few moments of terrifying silence, he chanced, "Hello?" and cringed at the empty echo of a response. Standing, dusting himself off, there was little snow that had fallen from up above and mostly dust from wooden beams that had not survived his descent and from the dirt that had gathered on what seemed to be old tiled floors. Trying again, a little emboldened now, he cupped his hands facing the opening where he had fallen through. "Can anyone hear me? Mr. Elrond, Bilbo? Arwen? Anybody?" Deep down, he knew his continued calls would go unanswered, but the fear of the never-ending darkness around him, and the obviously setting sun caused his heart to pound in his chest and his hands to shake. "Come on, Potter," he told himself firmly, "now is no time to panic." He tried to conjure up the bravery like those in the stories Bilbo or Floy or even the twins and Arwen and some of the other elves would tell him, either at mealtimes or before bed. He attempted to conjure that inner strength that many of them surely had felt in their own tales, like Bilbo with the dragon or Floy against orcs. But no matter how hard he tried, he began to feel his panic rise as the sun continued to fall and darkness, like the darkness in his cupboard, overtook what little light had poured through the hole up above. "I'm not there," he found himself chanting, closing his eyes and trying to breathe, "I'm not there." Privet Drive was nowhere on the same planet, he told himself. Uncle Vernon would never hurt him again. He thought of all the training to fight he had done, of the history, geography and language he had learned, of the peoples he found he was a part of the pure and beautiful magic of this world. This, he told himself, was where he belonged, and he would never return to the dinky cupboard under the stairs of number 4 Privet Drive. Despite his constant self-assurance, he couldn't stop the build-up of tears or the wobble in his legs. I'm not. The pounding in his heart overtook the silence in the echoing halls, and he swore it sounded like the footfalls of his uncle, angry at his choked sobs and filthy tears. I'm. He sobbed in absolute fear, shaking and falling to his knees, not registering the pain of a broken board scrapping him as he fell upon it. His body shook, a sweat broke over him as he attempted to breathe, closing his eyes making no difference to the unbroken blackness that now surrounded him, no light to be seen. He wanted to call out. He wanted the new loved ones he had grown so attached to and had been so happy to be accepted by so easily. He had everything he always wanted, now, so many people loving and doting after him much like Dudley got from his mother and father, but now he had so many, and none were here. His heart went cold as ice when he sensed more than anything, the presence. It had been a long time since he had felt it so strongly, not since the Shire. That dark lonely night when he had awoken screaming when seeing it fully formed. He didn't know what it was, it couldn't be a who even though it spoke. But he knew it was there, and it was watching him. Harry had never felt a fear so strong as this, and all he could think of was the only one who had ever banished the thing from him. "Floy!" he screamed, and he continued to scream crying, and despite the endless dark he knew there had been some sort of movement off in the distance in front of him. He shoved himself back, scooting in reverse knowing that it was toying with him. "Harry Potter," it was a hissed, broken sound and he cried out for Floy again. He had always been terrified of the dark, At times something tormented him in the back of his mind at number 4, but ever since entering Middle-earth, it had become more than just a fright that stayed to the edges of his mind or corner of his eye. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears running hot down his cheeks as he forced himself to try to not sob. The thing neared him. He could sense it, though he didn't know how, since the darkness was no different between his eyes being closed or open. Harry, he felt the hiss near him, and it was almost as if a pressure were pushing at him, though nothing physically touched him. Pootir. It stretched his name out again, as if to taste it, alone. I wonder if I could. He wasn't sure what it wanted to do, but the feel of something on his cheek sent a searing pain throughout his body, causing him to cry out in pain. But the thing cried out as well. It was flung back, and the pressure that had gathered in the air and atop the boy disappeared along with the creature. The thing was there, he knew still, and his cheek now burned more than any injury he had ever felt before. But with it, oddly enough, his forehead hurt too, even though the thing had never touched him there. It was as if the scar that he had all his life had become red hot, and he cried out in pain and fear, clutching his hands to his forehead. He rolled to his side, and subsequently felt something roll out of his pocket. He wasn't sure why he noticed this, or what about it pulled the pain away from his face and forehead enough for him to open his eyes, but then he saw it. As if he were in the light of day. The stone. Floy's stone. The ruins burned a golden yellow that somehow, by magic, it lit up the surrounding area, and Harry heard the thing hiss and retreat away to the shadows, he knew not where. Floy, he breathed, and gently grabbed the stone. It was warm and sent his body tingles, as if he had just been hugged. Floy. Floy, please be here. It pulsed, but the dwarf did not appear by his side as he had hoped. But he suddenly no longer felt so alone. He grasped the stone, light still surrounding him, though he didn't exactly see where it appeared from. He just knew Floy, somehow, was protecting him still through the stone. Harry sat for another few moments, wiping his eyes, taking great care for his raw cheek, though it didn't seem to be bleeding. He thought of his distant promise to Floy, of becoming strong and training, and for a moment he felt as if he had let the dwarf down. Pulling himself together, he stood, firm that he would find his own way out of the dark tunnels. Surveying the ruin, he noticed he seemed to be what looked like a hall. A grand one, maybe once that held many meetings or grand balls even. Details were difficult to make in the dim light, but there seemed to be many designs in the walls and pillars that surrounded him, and some statues stood untouched by time. Past the dust, the floors seemed to be made of tile, and different colors and designs were on those as well, though he didn't ponder over them. He spied the sack that he had been traversing through Rivendell with, and with the pang of hunger in his stomach he suddenly felt he realized that, thankfully, the food was still there that the kitchen elves had insisted he bring. After grabbing the bag and surveying dusty floors and distant hole in the ceiling, how did he fall such a great distance without becoming seriously injured? He wasn't sure, but he tried to brush it off as something he would wonder later. He grabbed a biscuit with clotted cream and nibbled at it, still surveying his surroundings. The thing was no longer there, he knew. He could no longer sense it. Harry would later on not be able to verbalize precisely why he felt this, but for the moment he put his trust in this feeling and pushed past his fear, clinging to the stone while slowly heading toward a staircase that led to even more shadow. He began to try and find his way out of the unknown chamber he found himself in. Meanwhile, in the halls of Rivendell, all eyes were out searching for the young elf, while one particular pair of eyes watched him from the shadows. Lord Elrond turned from where he was setting up another search team to join the many that had already been dispersed over the hours since Harry's disappearance to see Laroth and his husband Theodemar running over. They had been searching the grounds with a group of several others, and both were rushing to his side. "Tell me what you have found," Laroth began. "We had been searching the southern border, and tracked his prints in the snow away from the river. We followed for perhaps another quarter of a mile," Theodemar continued, the darker counterpart and generally more silent of the married couple, "before they disappeared. Entirely." Elrond's blood ran cold. "I feel," Theodemar pressed on, worry etched into his own face as well, "that the magic in that place is strong. He was pulled away, but if we try we may still be able to trace his whereabouts." Elrond knew precisely of what he spoke about. It was uncommon for elves, or most creatures aside for wizards, to travel in such a way. Magic was a thing that was embodied to objects that could be harnessed by some, occasionally pulled upon by a talented few from the surrounding elements, or pulled upon from their core like wizards. As to what could have managed to do such a feat to the small elfling, Elrond was unsure, but he nodded, instructing those at present to protect Rivendell, inform the hobbit, and then he would return. As they walked briskly to the horses outside, his mount already prepared by the stable hands that knew he would travel as soon as word was made about the boy, the others continued to inform him. Arwen is there as well with her search party. She states she had felt a disturbance in the area not long before and had come to search for what had unsettled her. She has attempted to trace the source of magic now. Elrond nodded. We shall assist her, then Theodemar. Elrond knew the dark elf was particularly keen on the touch of magic, as was his daughter, much as her mother had been, and would be sensitive to the traces of any spell left behind. They may be able to pull upon that remaining magic in the wards that were born from the land itself to find the young green-eyed boy. Elrond mounted his horse, following the two others, brow creased as he thought of his boy. His boy. How fast Harry had moved into their hearts. Elrond's just hoped that, for how fast he had moved into their hearts, he wouldn't be pulled away from them just as quickly. Harry wasn't sure how long he had been searching for a way out, but he was past exhausted. Despite having slept most the day, by a hit to the head or other he felt no pain from the fall still, and had pondered this more than once in the hours that he spent holding the warm stone while surrounded by the soft light. But after much time searching, and eating through all his food, he began to feel a bone-deep exhaustion, a stomach that was too empty, and a leg that hurt something fierce. Oh Floy. I don't know what to do. He thought of his lessons, of the tales he would listen to, but couldn't pull from any of them an answer to such a predicament. A whine sounded off behind him, almost as if in response to his plea to the stone, and he froze. The whine turned into a low grumble before becoming a huff of air. The warg. Had it managed to follow him here? The fear that had abandoned him hours ago was fast to return, and he swung around, breathing hard and falling on his behind. Two pinpricks in the dark reflected the light and he yelped, scrambling back, but he hit a stone wall. The warg approached, and Harry searched for something to use as a weapon. Despite how dusty the floors were wherever Harry traveled, though, there was nothing in quick grabbing range that he could use as a weapon. Large gray paws were the first thing visible in the orb of light that surrounded Harry, followed by a massive body. Go away. The beast paused, as if considering his request, and he watched it, not daring to blink. It took another, slower, step forward into the light to show a large head with clear blue eyes staring at him. After a few moments of the two staring at one another, both still and near silent aside for their breathing, Harry's fast and full of fear while the other's was slow and calm, Harry found his heart slowing as he observed the beast. Now Harry was no expert on wargs, not as if he had encountered them frequently, but his distant memory of when he had somehow survived the fearful beasts he had recalled their wild eyes, their scarred bodies. This beast had not a scar on its gray fur, and its eyes held intelligence almost. Are you not going to eat me? The large head cocked to the side and the great beast let out a huge sighing huff of air. Harry jumped at that, and the blue eyes almost rolled out of the gray head, they rolled so hard. Harry's brows knit. So, you won't eat me, and you're not going to hurt me? The other stepped forward, growling slightly, and he yelped, fear renewed, and he shook, closing his eyes and thrusting the warm stone of Floy's out in front of him in some feeble hope that it would protect him. He felt more than heard the paws near him, and then a cold wet nose touched his hand holding the stone. He screamed, jerking back, though felt no pain. Opening his eyes, he saw the other just staring. Almost as if he were one of Harry's teachers when Harry had done something he knew he should not have done, but could just not help himself. I'm sorry. He wasn't sure what else to say. Another snort. Harry decided that this was no warg, but perhaps a very large wolf. Weren't wolves supposed to be larger than dogs to begin with anyway? Well, this wolf sure was that big. Very big. He was as if he were 3 or 4 large dogs all put together. Standing on shaky feet, feeling once again the pain in his leg, he noticed the wolf still stood a few inches taller than he did. He gulped. Well, just in case you change your mind, I am rather skinny and wouldn't be much of a meal. The wolf blinked and then shook its head, chuffing its breath, before turning sparkling eyes back to Harry. He was sure the other was almost laughing at him. Being someone who not only moved past things quickly due to his age, but due to his upbringing, Harry quickly pressed, do you know the way out of here? I'm so tired, and I'm sore, and Lord Elrond will be worried in. The other head snapped to him and he closed his mouth with an audible click. The wolf gave a rumble and he cringed, though he felt no threat behind the sound. It was still frightening. They stood, once again staring at one another before the other gave out one of those deep sighs and nodded, kneeling much like a horse would to a rider. "You want me to hop on?" He had never rode a dog before, much less a wolf, but it seemed like it may be fun, especially considering that the sharp toothy bits would be away from Harry if he were on its back. The other groaned, and now he knew the wolf was exasperated. It was a word his English teacher used whenever Harry would daydream or forget his homework. He truly wanted to do his homework, but generally Dudley would ensure its destruction, or Uncle Vernon would take the bulb from his room, leaving him little light to read and write by. But exasperated was a word his teacher used, and now it was one he found himself using to describe the wolf. So, not wanting to exasperate the canine anymore, he awkwardly gripped at its shoulders, pulling some fur which it grunted over, and jumped onto its back. It stood and began to descend back down the way Harry came. For the first hour or so Harry stayed quiet, but then he noticed too many similar-looking places, and though he felt so tired now he was sluggish, he protested weakly. "We're going back. This is the exact way back to where I started." The other gave a small growl before looking over its shoulder at him and then looking back ahead, shaking its head. Harry couldn't argue any past that. He had no better plan, and he was just so bone-tired. He closed his eyes, allowing his head to bob. Just a little sleep, he promised himself. He would need it for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 11. Do not be ridiculous. You are an elf and there is no changing that. We will take you to Bree before we depart to our mines and you to your trees. Then, when you are among your own people you will find that you are truly happy. Harry flinched from sleep, tears distorting his dim vision as he woke from the dream. Memories in dreams appeared to hurt all the more than when they were recalled in waking moments. Perhaps it was when one dreamed, it was a sense of escape. Brief slices of perfection that could live out the night and remain a wish the following dawn. It took him a moment to recall the massive wolf, the coarse fur brushing his face as the heat of the moving bulk warmed him against the cool breeze that held the crisp smell of winter. Blinking, he sat up, the light of the stone still glowing in his pocket, where he had stashed it in fear of dropping the precious gift. Sitting up straighter, squinting his sight against the untouched darkness, he pulled the stone out, illuminating their path even more. "I don't think this is something you need," he found himself saying to his dual mode of transportation and companionship, "but it makes me feel better. There is a..." He paused, searching for the words. All his life, Harry had a sense of terror in the darkness, of a cruel existence that his young mind couldn't quite comprehend or even begin to explain. Yet, as with many subjects in his life, they were not the topic of discussion, due to lack of those who cared to listen or participate. "I don't like the dark," he finally breathed, and his heart and shoulders felt heavier than they had before when weighted with words he couldn't form. The wolf simply huffed in reply, steering them to the center of the room that Harry had found himself in to begin with, below the lazy fall of snow winking silver in the moonlight. "I can't get back up there," he stated, feeling dumb, and the wolf gave no notice. Instead, the wolf made its way to the small circle of light enhanced by the falling snow catching on the moon, spun 3 times, before laying down with a loud sigh, almost sending Harry toppling over its muzzle. After a moment of silence, the wolf's eyes were closed and breathing was eased. Harry slid off and frowned. One eye slid open momentarily to observe him, before sliding back to match its partner in what seemed a dismissal. "That's it then." Harry crossed his arms, emulating his teachers when they had become cross with him. "We're just going to go the way back here to go to sleep in the snow." Again, one eye slid open, but seemed to roll before closing this time. Frowning, Harry uncrossed his arms, looking around. What was he to do? After napping, sleep was the last thing he wished for, and resting his legs seemed to have alleviated any serious pain into a dull ache, so walking was not irrational. A breeze blew the twinkling snow down a little harder, into small cold missiles that battered his cheeks. It didn't hurt, the wind wasn't terribly harsh, but his cheeks and nose were reminded of the chill in the air all the more with their burn. "Well, you stay here, then," he said far more bravely than he felt, using his irritation to fuel his words as he turned back to the stairs he had originally climbed. "But I'm not Wah." He found his frustration clipped short, then heightened when seeing the wolf, both eyes open and staring at him in what seemed annoyance, was now holding between its teeth the seat of his trousers. "Wah. You stay here and freeze if you want. I want to go home." As soon as he uttered the words, his heart twisted and clipped his argument short. Home. He had realized for some time, now, that Rivendell was beginning to seem more like home than he had ever wanted to accept, and with that acceptance, he felt a sort of guilt to Floy. Shoulders dropping, he jerked his blurring eyes away from the wolf sniffling, wishing all the more the burly dwarf were here to encase him in a warm embrace. Knowing that were impossible, and his heavy heart reminding him it may never be plausible, he hiccuped before inhaling noisily, the heavy sensation on his shoulders and heart increasing as his breath did in number, trying to rid of feeling, but it only seemed to surge all the more. The wolf had stood, again, now standing to his side, and he was dimly aware of its hot breath on his forehead, making him think of the few times that Floy had kissed his crown. And finally tears fell red-hot down his cold burning cheeks. Dropping as if wounded, he began to cry, big ugly sobs he couldn't recall last doing. There were no words, what could he say? How silly would it sound if he were to say he loved Floy with all his heart, but maybe he loved Rivendell and the elves more? But he didn't want to love them more, and he wished for Floy, which made his head spin and stomach turn. Was Floy right? Would he someday forget the dark dwarf in his hands that were thick and weathered from work and battle, his beard scratchy but maintained with pride, of his deep humming voice, not talented by any means but soothing to Harry? I just don't know. He found himself crying into the bristly fur of the wolf's shoulder, and felt its bony head bump his slightly. I don't. This was all Harry had been able to utter, drained and doubtful of how to articulate all that the surrounding darkness and solitude seemed to command in him. The elfling wasn't sure how long he wept. It had been quite some time since he had stopped crying out words and had moved to bawling before dying down into soft whimpers, realizing he ended up against the wolf's side, curled much as the wolf was on the edge of the pool of light. At the end of his cries, energy exerted, it seemed as if he could now pay the area around him more attention. It wasn't as if it had changed. The shadows were still innate and vast, the tiles still old, large, and chipped in places. Pillars now only suggested shadows outlined his area. The snow still danced down in twinkling masses, undaunted by the occasional gust that would bellow it into different bouncing clusters before falling to scattered out of the moonlight on the floor, or to join atop the pile most prominent under the hole or atop of him and his companion. But, his ears perked after a while of watching this. There was a sound on the wind that he hadn't heard over his cries. Straining his ears, he realized the wolf, too, had heard the noise, its head raised and large semi-floppy ears perked up. Breathing, he dried his face, blinking, a sort of relief from the energy spent crying, and stood as did his companion, holding his breath. Another, stronger burst of wind, and with it, Calamoran. That was Auntie. He jerked, eyes wide to the opening at the isolated voice on the wind. Arwen sounded both far away and near. I'm here. I fell down, but I'm here. Calamoran, we are here. Calamoran, return to us. It was louder this time. The wind gusted harder with the words, and Harry was forced to blink dry eyes. The wolf, giving some sort of garbled bark, nosed under his arm and kneeled. Pausing merely a second, he climbed atop the beast's bristle fur, trying not to breathe too loudly, but his excitement increased his breaths. Auntie Arwen. I'm here. I fell down. This way, Calamoran. His aunt's voice was closer now, the wind gusting abundant into a full gale with it blurring his V-zone. Pull yourself to the side. Slide in as you slid out. He was perplexed, but didn't have much time to ponder the words as the wolf under him began to vibrate, and soon he found it a deep and constant rumble of a growl. Harry seized tighter the wolf, his stone, and his eyes as a great eruption of wind blew hard, and he felt the wolf in him shift, and then Calamoran. He was blinking, gasping for a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Under him the wolf collapsed into the snow, lit now by that of lamplight and magic, surrounded by a circle of roughly a dozen elves. At the sight of the great beast, many jerked, reaching for weapons, and Harry blinked, still gasping, finding Arwen standing and surging forward to grip him. Don't hurt him, he sputtered, still breathless, panting, labored as if he had been squeezed in a too tight hug. He helped me. Arwen lifted him from the wolf, who he saw now to not only be fully gray in color, but to sport short stubby fur on his front like a wolf, which turned into a wavier, longer look by the time it reached his hindquarters and down the length of a long flowing tail. The gray ears held a teasing of this fur as well, though just barely as they stood half up, flopped over more like that of a common housedog than that of a wolf's pointed ears. Flanking his daughter, Elrond placed a steady hand to Harry's dark hair, but his eyes were trained on the wolf. "I know you," finally he spoke, "or, of you. You, my friend, for I believe you are of such, are quite familiar to me." The wolf stood, shaking its fur and panting, taking into account all present, giving an intelligent gaze to all, pausing for a long while on Harry before sliding to Eldrin. The beast may have owned that of a canine mouth, but the words that emitted were almost human, and completely sound as such. "I am known as Saren, and of your knowing me it is but what you have seen and read of my distant predecessor Huon that conveys you any acquaintance." A deep feminine voice sounded from not quite past the teeth, but from Saren as she gazed head raised to the listening troop, "And, like my ancestor, I have been gifted from the Valar to speak but 3 times until my death. So, hear me now. A shadow threatens to affect these lands, one that arises from the other place using Harry Potter. And thus being, he must return to that of which is not above, nor below, but astride our own world, if it is not to be subjugated to that of terror and unspeakable horrors which have threatened the freedom of those who would live on Middle-earth. There he will face this darkness and must school himself in ways that could never be achieved in Middle-earth, and if triumphant shall be permitted admission to that of returning. But, fear not, for it will not be for many moons now until he must leave, for now is when the darkness that follows him is at its weakest, and it will take time for it to grow into its power. Just tonight, by finding me in the world astride our own, he has proven his fluidity among Middle-earth, and that of this other place. This is not for me to deem essential, however, the Valar, who need no explanation as to their commands and affairs. I am but a devoted servant, and I vow to guard Harry Potter with my life in his subsequent noble quest. Such was the way of Huon, such shall be my path." With that, Saren fell silent of any further words of speech beyond that of her own kind, and the elves' hearts filled with worry and confusion of the fate of the young, strange elfling that had entered into their lives. Harry rode with Arwen returning to Rivendell, eyes watching Saren as she followed easily astride the horses, falling just below many of their shoulders. He couldn't fathom what the implication of tonight had been, and he assumed neither could the elves, as for all were silent in their steady progression from the ruins that were much further from where he had wandering safely among Rivendell's halls. Elrond rode ahead, escorting the now divided search party, many of the elves having returned to their previous task of scouting the lands to ensure their safety. His face was a mask of confidence as he led the group, but his mind and his heart were a flurry of turmoil as they tried to work out what was to come next. In the days that followed, it would be explained to Harry about many things. About the history of Huon, a great wolfhound and one of the hunting dogs of Oromavala. Of the other places that Saren spoke of, and of what had happened that night. Of it being an odd and very rare thing for an elf to hold such magic that Harry held, but not unheard of. That there had been knowledge, however faint, among the fair people of worlds that existed almost overlapping their own, and how Harry's magic had been enhanced surely by the magic of Rivendell itself allowing him to travel. Arwen, like her mother and gifted with small graces of such magic, spoke softly to Harry of deeper enchanted things that were quite unlike the ring her father owned or lands woven with it over millennia of time upon their creation. She, with the help of 8 other elves present at the gathering that had greeted Harry upon his return, all of whom were in some way or another intimately touched by this type of magic, had been able to reach into this other place in their search for Harry. As it was, she was only dimly aware of those who presented in other worlds, sometimes able to sort of step to the side as it were to see them or hear them. It wasn't something she did often, but something she was quite aware of. It had frightened her that Harry had seemed to burst back and forth to the other places, and, after further consultation, they all reasoned this was how he had arrived in Middle-earth, though Harry had not divulged the story in detail. Just that he had pushed through a door the opposite way it should open. He shuddered at the last memory he harbored of his uncle, and swore it never to be spoken of. Harry was then further schooled on places in the world with fractures, or otherwise known as places, such as he had found, far easier to enter the other world than what would be normal. They were few known, the area he himself had stepped from being the ruins of a town that had briefly been structured on the edge of what was at the time outside the last homely houses lands by refugees of Eregion, until those two had been destroyed and they pressed further north for peace in Rivendell's walls. It was a place of great energy and emotion, Arwen had said, leaving a sort of fracture upon the earth that had never fully healed, and so with effort one could slip through the crack. Though, when asked, she couldn't further explain this phenomenon herself, only that perhaps her grandmother would be of proper guidance when they went to see her the following summer. Harry thought of all of this, soundlessly, taking in the education that was flung at him in all manners. Those of swordsmanship, and archery, of language and geography, and most vast and difficult of all that of magic. The elves, ever a race of sound confidence and refined grace, ensued in a mute hysteria, which gave Harry ever the more reason to be filled with fear and uncertainty. Harry took the days on with dread, the promise serene and spoken ringing in his mind often. And thus being, he must return to that of which is not above, nor below, but astride our own world, if it is not to be subjugated to that of terror and unspeakable horrors which have threatened the freedom of those who would live on Middle-earth. Harry heard this and shuddered in memory. As for he knew, in the darkest corners of a room, in that of the darkest reaches of his mind, the evil laughed. And Harry feared it had already won, though precisely what he was not certain. On such a night nearly a week after the events of such things, with Seren sleeping in her own bed in his room, he rolled over, gripping the precious stone Floy had gifted him, and whispered, "I love you, Floy. I really do," and with it he fell into a fitful sleep, his heart aching and hoping that he could become the brave warrior he wished to be, to ensure Floy's pride and love. Far away, in a deep cave that glittered with precious rock by torchlight, Floy jerked his head, searching for the voice of the boy who still held hooks into his soul. And he groaned as Balin looked on with a knowing gaze. Walking to the jeweler, he laid a hand on his friend's shoulder, their bond having grown within the journey they had took. "Go, then, my friend. Go for a week's time to ensure the safety of the lad and my dear friend Bilbo. The hordes of scum are no any a thing for us to worry over, and we will continue to dig down, and continue to build our walls so that, when he is ready, you may have the boy see the spectre that is our halls. You said so yourself, that you would ensure the elf child to experience such beauty and grandeur as that of our magnificent halls that we will surely make to match that of Erebor itself." After this speech, which rose to a crescendo come the end, many of the surrounding dwarves working on engravings and decorating of the newly recaptured hall stopped sending hollers of delight. Even Ori paused in his tedious script of their quest to stand he himself had suggested just earlier that day while decapitating the last of a goblin horde nearby quarters an elf may see as comely. As for they would be more open than that of an average dwarven bedroom, hand-jerking up, accidentally pitching ink across not only his face but that of a few unfortunate a dwarf that had been near him, causing them to halt their cheers into cries of indignation and his cheeks to burn with a deep blush as he quickly sat down. Floy held his gaze to the white-haired dwarf, ignoring the background noise of those celebrating their most recent conquest and assured upcoming ones, before raising his eyes to one of the numerous columns that shone bright from the half-moon's light from expertly constructed windows high above that fixed the light to all the glittering gems that adorned the hall, fashioning a ceiling of twinkling stars. Harry. Chapter 12. Wishing for sunny skies. The days passed by, the snow built up and then receded to piles of slush, then puddles, before the earth was silent underfoot, and brilliant shades of green surrounded them. Harry had grown more familiar with the elves' concept of time. It had been many months, but to their long-lived minds it was merely a week. The yen they reflected on consisted of 144 years, and for the turning of season there was little concept of difference in time to the elves. It was infuriating, though, despite his near year being in Middle-earth now, and his feeling of growth, if not physically, mentally and emotionally, felt tremendous, the elves silently hinted promise that it would all seem so little a moment, once he was older. He was glad they at least acknowledged the changing of seasons. He supposed even near immortal beings were forced to adhere to such things, for their ways of life reflected that of the years much as any humans did, if not in a different fashion. They called it Tweel, but between Bilbo and himself, they were in the earliest part of spring, a brief affair where the remains of winter clung to the edges of the day, and the nights remained chilled. Harry found himself out in the waking gardens, sighing at the warmth the sun provided after a cloud passed, and looked at the unfurling birch trees beginning to filter the light through their emerging leaves. The air smelled cool, wet yet with the snow that clung stubbornly to the lowest most shaded areas of the woods and last homely house. He eyed the cloudy blue skies, silently imagining himself flying along with the birds that sung overhead. How wonderful that would be! "Harry, my boy," he turned, grinning to Bilbo who, now, was fully healed, "you missed breakfast." The most important meal of the day, Harry echoed the well-repeated reminder, grinning as the hobbit huffed, crossing his arms, a flush dusting his round cheeks. It most likely was a heinous crime in the Shire to miss a meal, for how Bilbo prattled on about such. That, and their mannerisms were rather odd, he thought, as Bilbo explained Shire edict that he himself no longer followed, and Harry could understand why. But just the same, his heart lifted at his thoughts. Bilbo was still a hobbit at his core, and food and shared meals were such an important thing to him. Such a brat, muttered the hobbit, fussing over imagined dirt on the small elf, and Harry let him. A meal spent alone will always be a meal not worth tasting, finished Harry, again in unison, and dodged the light swat the other sent his way. But if it isn't the purpose of children but to age their elders, Bilbo intoned, and dimples appeared on Harry's cheeks as he found himself unable to stop grinning to the other. He crossed his arms again and looked sternly to the boy. If you hadn't missed eating with everyone, you would have been updated on next week's plan. Harry felt the smile on his face falter, looking to Bilbo, whose own face softened at the boy's realization. Already, Harry hated how weak his voice was and how his throat clenched, as if swallowing was something that didn't happen naturally. Harry, Bilbo's shoulders dropped. We knew this was to come as soon as the roads cleared well enough for travel. He nodded, taking a deep breath in. The previous fall's travel with the hobbit to the last homely house seemed like such a very long time ago. Watching the elder first unresponsive in bed for such a long time, and for most of the winter held to the confines of bed as his body worked hard to recover from the attack, had been frightening. He had spent many evenings in the other's company, and had even made a point of having many breakfasts with the hobbit, knowing the other's consideration to how important it was to eat with loved ones. Who will go with you? Do you think, maybe, I could go to at least the edge of Elrond's lands just to see you off? We could ask it, Bilbo said hesitantly. Though doubt lay thick in his voice, it was no secret that after the previous winter's excursion, Harry was rarely alone, and never left the grounds. Hence why, this morning, he had snuck out before breakfast to be by himself. I will, the boy stated firmly. Bilbo smiled gently, and as for who I travel with, it will be a small group of elves, sure to meet others on the road. Harry blinked. Oh, why are the elves traveling? Harry had never seen the elves leave in groups outside of hunting and scouting parties. It was odd, but he supposed that with the breakup of snow and ice, the elves perhaps made ventures outside of their own realms. Harry was quite aware that the Greenwood and Lothlorien realms, and tried to recall his geography lessons on any other elven homes that could be closer to the Shire. He considered there may have been one, but he was also ashamed to silently admit to himself he had forgotten who they were. He did remember, though, quite clearly that the dwarves dwelled in the Blue Mountains just outside the Shire. There is a party preparing to head to the Grey Havens, lad, explained Bilbo after a moment. Oh, Harry thought for a moment, I think I remember that. He deflated again, but still, when will I be able to see you again? Oh my lad. I am very much thankful for the journey we had with one another. There was that twinkle in the hobbit's eye that he often held when telling the stories of his ventures with the dwarves. It made my soul feel alive. I will once again journey to see these lands, and the mountains. Oh Harry, I wish to see mountains one last time before. At the complete loss of Harry's smile and downcast gaze, his voice softened and he lay a hand on the small hunched shoulder. Now my boy. I am sorry. I am nowhere close to my time, and I for sure will be returning to see how much you have grown. Be patient, for you will age slowly, being an elf. Patience is the virtue your people hold most dear, I feel. The last was grumbled, as if in memory of something. You won't take too long, though, will you? Or maybe I will be able to see you. I'm sure in maybe 5 or 6 years I will be old enough to come visit. I'll be a teenager after all, almost a grown-up. A laugh from behind had the two turning to see Elladan and Elrohir approaching. The two elves looked like a reflection of one another, and often with or without meaning to Harry wasn't certain moved as one. You are still too heavily influenced, Elladan laughed, by the human ways. As for they may be seen as of age and independent when only a mere 14 years of age or so, you will find you have quite a bit more time to learn and grow. Father would never dream of allowing you to leave before you age at least 500 years. Harry's mouth dropped open, sidestepping Elladan's outstretched arms. But that's not fair. I must go before then. What about Bilbo? My boy, Bilbo soothed between the twins, I promise I will return. As I said, I dream of seeing the mountains again. But, my boy, Right now I yearn for home. For my hearth and my armchair. My books and maps. The comforts I enjoy so at ease there that cannot be found on the road. And, he continued at the mulish expression Harry sent his way in response, I must return home, to my nephew Frodo. I have missed his last birthday, which we share, and must see him now to make it up to him. Then I could meet him, argued the young elf. However much I would love that, Bilbo crouched in front of the dark-haired elf. A little uncertain as for the boy wasn't one to argue, Frodo is rather young. We have a lot of time for that to happen. Perhaps when he is of age, and his parents won't throw me into the river for corrupting their only boy, I can take him with me to come see you. Harry didn't respond, so Bilbo pressed further, I may be turning 90 this year, but Frodo will be only 12. He is very young for a hobbit, yet, and won't be old enough to leave this far from home for another 21 years at least. 21 years. Harry yelled, that is so long, you'll be so old, I'll be old enough to go before then. He looked up to the twins stubbornly, right? I could meet Frodo, he is my age, we could play together. Oh Calamoran. I do feel for you not having a playmate of age, sympathized Elladan. It having been so long since any elf child has been able to join us. So please, Calamoran, realize we treasure you more than you can realize. At his huffing, Elrohir joined his brother opposite side of Harry, and if you were to leave so soon, surely you would miss your party. Harry frowned. Party? Yes, Elladan enthused. Soon we will be sending word to the rest of the elven homes about your arrival, and we will be hosting celebrations. Why, if you were to leave, you would miss the arrival of all those who wish to meet you. I don't want a party. Harry turned his head to look down at the ground. It had been such a beautiful morning. He hadn't wanted to think of these things. Of the reality that Bilbo would be going. Harry wouldn't be able to hear the other tell his tales that were so enthralling, or to have his morning breakfast with him anymore, splitting his morning toast with the hobbit as for the elf preferred the warm grain dishes or eggs to the bread. Bilbo hadn't ever pressed or asked much of Harry, even though Harry knew he always wondered. The toast, no matter how great, reminded him of the dry bread and cheese hunks he sometimes was left to have at the Dursleys. And Harry had always been thankful for Bilbo's willing to take his. But there was more, and his heart twisted at the thought. I have to leave though, mumbled the boy, and he began to take great gulps of air, eyes burning while he began to shake. 21 years will be too long. 10 years will be. I can't wait such a very long time. And at his wails, hot tears came to his eyes, his fighting there falling, until Bilbo wrapped the boy in his arms, and Elladan settled a hand on his back. The comfort and support of those around him made them fall even more. Not only would he maybe never see Bilbo again, and if he did it could be the final time before his death, but he had yearned to find any sign of Floy, to travel to the mountains of Moria to find the wonderful mines the dwarves spoke about and show the dwarf the skills he had obtained with the sword, of surely how much he would have grown by his teen years. To hug the dwarf tightly and show the other that he was capable of protecting not only himself, but Floy as well. The tears did not stop for quite some time, and all the twins and Hobbit could do was try to calm him and give him comfort. A week passed by far faster than Harry would have liked to imagine, whereas the year itself had crawled and the idea of 21 years unfathomable. It was the early gray dawn of the morning. The chill in the air was still enough that one could possibly still see their breath. Harry had spoken little that week, and at the few requests and questions to Elrond and the other elves of when he could possibly be old enough to travel, he was met with infuriating answers. In time, but not so soon. There are only a handful of years until you are not so young. Why not wait a few hundred years? To those who have spent so little time on this world, asking for patience is to ask so much. But, as with all, and age, you will find it Calamoran. And so on. Harry held onto Saren's fur, sobbing pathetically into her coat as she lay atop his bed, dwarfing the furniture with her massive form. Her own lavish cot was abandoned for most these nights, much as it was now. It's not fair. He sniffled, rubbing his nose on his arms. It's not. Bilbo is a hobbit. I asked how old hobbits get, and Bilbo once said it was about 100. Saren pulled back her great head, and, for a dog that could not speak anymore, she made up for it with her expressions. Harry had been unaware of dogs' ability to morph their features. His only canine interactions had been with his aunt's dogs before, which had always consisted of him running up a tree, and he read plainly on her face the exasperation. But it's true. A huff of air across his wet cheeks slowed the tears and sobs. He said it himself. A groan, and she shook her head, eyes glancing to the door in the direction of Bilbo's room before back to him. Harry thought for a moment before saying, "Well, he is turning 90 this year, he says." At the cocked head he continued, "But he also said he doesn't seem to have aged a day over 50. He thought of all the times Bilbo mentioned it to him, a hand ferreting away into his pocket to fiddle with something. The action brought a twist to the boy's guts. It told him something was wrong. "But, I want to see Floy." At the grumbled doggish noise she made he pursed his lips, sitting up and rubbing his wet cheeks. "But I do, I miss him, and he." Harry cut himself off, and his eyes became wet again. Did Floy miss him? It had been a lingering question. He understood Floy was busy, was far away deep into a mountain helping craft it into the great halls that dwarves proudly called home. Remembering to when they were on the road, he knew Floy had once said offhandedly one night along the fireside. "Ah, well then, lad. It will take a great deal of time for us to work on those mines. Long they have been abandoned by our folk. 5-10 years I would think, before we could even think of asking you for a visit. I should be old enough in 5 years. Harry looked to Saren, who shook her head and licked his face. "You stop, gross urine." His annoyance morphed into laughter as the dog began licking him all over his face and ears, giving big whiffs of breath to his messy hair. Okay, I get it." His giggles slowing, he lay back down next to the dog, stroking her fur languidly as the energy that had followed his early morning nightmare left him, and he yawned. "I don't know how they expect me to wait so long, though. Dudley will probably be driving a car by then. And almost old enough to have a job and a house and a wife and all of those things." Another yawn stole the boy's next complaints, and he snuggled up to the great dog even more, sighing. "I miss you, Floy. I cannot wait to be grown up enough to go see you in your mines." Equals. Now, my boy. Bilbo was hugging him again, his voice tight. "I don't want any tears." It sounded as if the hobbit was fighting his own away, but it was quite unlike Bilbo to overly emotional. Instead, the portly fellow pulled away, sucking in a deep breath, and gave a brilliant smile down to the young boy. "How can you be so happy?" Harry questioned, frowning. Bilbo thought for a moment before putting his arm around the boy's shoulder. "In the Shire," Bilbo finally said, turning to look the direction he would be headed on with the group of elves that were giving their final preparations, his expression softening with something Harry couldn't quite explain. "There is a sort of saying." The hobbit paused, thinking. "I used to live by it, in my most lonely, darkest of times." He turned his gaze to the sky, wistful on what was sure an onslaught of memories. "Winter will come, but all the harder if you allow it to bring you tears." Harry frowned at the hobbit, who caught the look and laughed in earnest, expression breaking into true merriment at the boy's expense. "Oh my boy," his laughter died down and his smile softened. "I want you happy. You want me happy. Knowing that the other is alive and well and having the best of their days is what is important, yes?" Harry nodded slowly after a moment, still frowning, brows knitted. "Then, even if I am not beside you for breakfast toast, I am still smiling at home, thinking of you and how very much you will be learning here. I will be excited to see how much you have grown, when I do come to visit, for I will." "You promise," Harry said firmly, and Bilbo nodded. "I promise." Harry sat at the lip of the outermost gardens facing the lands that Bilbo and the party of elves departing traveled, his own elven eyes straining to catch a glimpse of them, perhaps one last time, in the setting sun. Arwen had been with him until a few moments before, allowing him to be alone in silence to think of what a not loss this was. A year before he had said goodbye to Floy. He had told himself he would grow strong and show Floy how well he would learn to protect them both. He thought of the shadow monster, and how it had not bothered him since that winter. But the presence at times prickled at him in the most darkest and loneliest of times. And how his fear mounted at the very aspect of seeing it again. Harry considered that, perhaps his inability to face the monster spoke a level of how he was truly not ready to see Floy. But that, maybe, in 5 or maybe as long as 10 years those skills would increase enough to be worthy of his venture out of the last homely house. Then he thought of Bilbo. Knowledge was something the hobbit treasured greatly. That of maps and cultures and language. He often would speak Sindarin with the other elves and Harry, to help the boy's ears grow more accustomed to the tongue. He spoke in Elvish riddles, too, which often turned the boy's head. Even would refer to the elven calendar of the yen, frustrating himself along with Harry. Harry knew that next he saw the hobbit he must be fluent in his language, learn his geography better. "Why, my boy," Bilbo had exclaimed only days before when he admitted not recalling if there were any elvish lands near the Shire, "you are greatly lacking, for there are some of the most important there. I hope next I see you, you will lecture me about them, and even be able to find some books on the hobbit's history, just to impress the elder." Had it only been a handful of months before, when he remembered Bilbo telling him of when he had lost first his parents, then Thorin, Fili, and Kili. Family. Harry, he held the small hand in his, looking into the boy's eyes earnestly. "I do not know how to help you until you are able to see Floy again. But I do not you mused not let your sorrow consume you. For it will drain way at you until you find how to combat it. I would hate for Floy to see you or know you are burdened with such sorrow." The goodbyes Bilbo had to give to all of them had been of a different kind than the goodbyes Harry gave today. He remembered how Bilbo had tried to enrich him by giving him purpose, to turn his pain into something other than wasted time. Harry was eager to do that for Bilbo until they met again. He became so lost in his thoughts that the son's departure went unnoticed by him until he was jerked from his thinking by a hand gently laid on his shoulder. Blinking, he looked up to Elrond, who smiled serenely down to the small child. Graceful as any of their kind, he perched himself upon the overlook with the boy, and silently looked to the darkening sky, eyes quickly finding the evening star. Saren was rarely far from Harry, and was napping under one of the tables, the one Harry had silently sat at during dinner, nibbling his meal between sadness and thought. Elrond continued to sit quietly, and Harry found himself in a stir after a moment, unable to fall back into silent contemplation. "I find myself," he blurted out to the dark-haired elf who was unmoving at the show of excitement, "saying a lot of goodbyes ever since I have come to Middle-earth." Elrond looked to him in acknowledgement, eyes imploring him to continue. He nibbled his lip, looking down to the lands Bilbo must be sleeping in himself, somewhere out past the river and the trees, but far enough on the distant plain Harry could not spot even a distant fire. "It is such a lot," he finally said, not looking away from somewhere, where there were stone trolls that were forever motionless that Bilbo and company had tricked into morning light, where somewhere the Shire lay as it always had with his mundane and comely life of simplicity. Where, very far away, there was a mountain with Floy, surely toiling away through even now, he was so eager to carve in a new home from the rock. He stopped, his gaze faltering to all that he wished to see, that was out of his reach, but he knew was there. He looked to Elrond, who sat still watching him. "I never knew my parents. I always wished I did. I always pretended stories of them and said good night and goodbye for school while by myself." Harry felt his brow knit together in deep thought, mulling over what he was thinking. Exactly what he was trying to say was hard to conjure up as he found himself piecing together the puzzle all beings are given, that puzzle that is life. "I don't think," he finally concluded, brows raising as did his voice, "I just don't think I ever had anyone to ever say goodbye to, and I find it rather hard." It was a truth. Back at number 4, none would care if he stayed or left. His presence was a bother that he gently tried not to bring notice to, and he spent his days existing alongside the Dursleys. The Dursleys were so enamored with themselves, their day-to-day, his aunt and uncle so loving to Dudley, and so cold to him. He never said good morning, never had a well-wished day at school, was never given luck, and with it, most certainly never had to say goodbye. "Would you?" Elrond finally spoke, seeing the child trying to piece together what he had just come to realize, "go back to never having anyone to say goodbye to?" "No," Harry said passionately, voice raised. "I love it here. I just love everyone and everything, and I don't want anyone to go." Then, Elrond smiled, "It is an important thing to learn, in life, how that love is the most valuable gift and how you should cherish it, even if the one who graced you with it is no longer with you." Harry saw something in Elrond's normally smooth face, a sort of cracking he couldn't explain, but it was something unsettling, something not good. "I do cherish it," Harry said, and found himself scooting into the dark-haired elf's lap, not liking that cracked expression that he couldn't name, but his soul trembled at. "I wish it was just easier to say goodbye to." The tall elf's arms encased him tightly, tighter than Elrond had ever hugged him before, and Harry found himself using all his strength he could in return, his small arms barely reaching all the way around the elder's chest. After a while he breathed in the smell of cedar and rain. That smell was the calming scent always on Elrond, turning his face away from the chest so as not to be muffled by the fabric. When will I be old enough to go and visit everyone I miss, Elrond? I can't barely stand to wait 5 years, and everyone says that isn't anywhere near enough time. Harry was sure he felt a smile on the other's lips as they pressed into the top of his head before Elrond pulled him away a bit to look down at him, his usual serene expression in place. There will someday be a day where you are not in urgency to learn something, to discover things, to see tomorrow, Elrond finally said, and it is close to when you begin to think of the days like this, just enjoying the moments you're in and not seeking enjoyment in what is to come, that you will find yourself old enough. Harry looked at him in puzzlement, pondering before slowly saying, so, it is not number of years but, when I am ready. Elrond for some reason found this amusing, for his face broke into a rare, great smile and he threw his head back in laughter. Harry wasn't certain what he had said, but he smiled a little, glad that whatever had taken the elf earlier was not visible. Come, Calamoran. It is late, and I believe Arwen had wished for you to resume your lessons in the coming day. They had been paused all week in favor of Harry clinging to Bilbo as much as he could. Elrond stood, picking the boy up in his arms with ease, and turned to enter the house when they heard the sound of a bird's wings. Turning, the elves witnessed a very large raven swoop around, once, twice, 3 times before perching itself neatly where the two had been only moments before. It did a hop, cocking its head to the side to eye them before clearing its throat, and in a croaky voice spoke. Message for Harry Potter, message for Harry Potter. Floy, son of Froy, son of Frandon, wishes to deliver a message. And just as quickly as Harry had felt his sadness that past week pull him down, he felt himself elated as if he were truly able to fly with the raven away in the sky, the freedom of wings gifted to him in just those few words. The bird looked the two up and down before continuing. He says the message is for Harry Potter, and Harry Potter alone, unless said otherwise, not for any old stinking pointed ear leaf brain to hear. And Harry was so excited, he barely could take notice to the terrible insult directed Elrond's way. Floy had reached out to him, he had not forgotten. And in his pocket, the stone was as warm and thrumming with warmth as ever. Chapter 13 Part 1 Chapter Notes. I had lost the original chapter in whole last week and it was painful to rewrite. Originally, this was the halfway point, but I wrote up to all I had lost and felt rather drained. So instead of the initially planned 15 chapters, I have now changed it to 16. But I am someone who laments for quite some time after losing work I was fond of. I feel this chapter pales in comparison to what I originally had written, and am mostly just looking for assurance. Haha. Rewriting it had been difficult, but I passed that hurdle, at least, and will press on to the other half of what was supposed to be this chapter. Thank you, and as always, please review. I love hearing thoughts on my work. Chapter 13.1 Calamoran. I would rethink your poor attempt at an exit if I were you. Harry froze, foot comically held in mid-step as he peered over his shoulder to where Arwen's back faced him as she shuffled some books aside and inspected the papers that had been not hidden under them per se, just temporarily disposed of under the heap of texts he was to be reading. How did she manage to do that? But it was time. It was finally approaching time for Floy to be visiting, and Harry didn't know how to contain his excitement. It had been nearly 10 years, 1 decade since the departure of Bilbo, and the arrival of the Raven had given him means of loss and gain so swiftly in one night. The mines are vast and we have cleared much of the ilk that has sullied them, the Raven had relayed to Harry that night. We plan to dig deep, much deeper, as for the wealth is tremendous and the halls will be grand. Descriptions of the glittering halls, the sparkling ceilings as if it were the night sky made Harry's heart flutter. The disappointment that Floy was unable to leave, quite yet, without worry that the other dwarves may see it fit for him to not be able to uptake his position upon return was palpable. Harry knew, now, how very much dwarves hated elves, and he was well aware that many in the troop he had first stumbled upon wouldn't have done a fraction of what Floy and Balin did for him. The Raven correspondence had been going on since then. Every 4 or 6 months, Harry was graced with a message from one of the intelligent sleek black birds, while simultaneously the elves were subject to a slurry of insults. It came to be that the telltale sound of the raven's wing would cause the occupants of Rivendell to react between cringing with irritation and rubbing their brows with annoyance. Namely, Elrond. As for it seemed with the response of the first message, Harry's introduction of him and explanation that he was his family and overseeing the boy's care made it so. Floy directed many regards to thanks and comments on elven upbringing, and their heads stuck up in the trees' ears filled with leaves came up. There had even been a time when one of the ravens sung a very dwarvish tavern song in the tale that Floy had given of a recent uproarious celebration they had. Of course, the elves were horrified whenever Harry hummed it absent-mindedly under his breath. Harry of course shared no such qualm, and instead relished in the arrival of every single bird. Somali informed up near a month ago that it would be this week we should expect Floy's arrival. He turned back to the library, which shared the task of classroom, as he drug his feet dramatically over to the book and paper-filled table. How can I be expected to study about old kings if something so amazing is happening? He threw himself over the table dramatically, looking up to Arwen, who merely quirked an eyebrow and crossed her arms. "My Calmeron, your patience still has not found you," she admonished. "It would be wise for you to not only focus on your histories but—" Her cool expression went from watching him to eyes narrowing at the parchment near his shoulder. "Your written word is—" It was generally with his calligraphy Arwen would find herself tongue-tied and appalled. No elf in all of Middle-earth would ever display such scrawl. Harry both became amused and embarrassed by her reactions. "Oh come on please Arwen. Sissy." He widened his eyes to gaze up at her from his upside-down vantage point still sprawled across the table. "The day beautiful. And I just know Floy will arrive today." As claimed every day this week, she huffed, the irritation not fully having left her from seeing his absolutely depressing written word. "And," he continued, widening his eyes even further, "I don't know how I could possibly be requested to read any more stuffy moth-ridden." He bit his tongue as her brows rose in warning, and he backtracked. "I mean carefully gathered literary genius about kings of old, when the dwarf who saved me has finally been able to come." It had been originally planned for him to venture to the last homely house 2 years prior. Unfortunately, a poorly timed hillside had decimated the main road, and it had taken several seasons for them to open the mountain pass well enough for transportation to make its way smoothly with wagon. The raven prior to the last one, Somali, who had grown to be one of Harry's favorites, apparently the great-grandmother of two and cousin to another that visited Harry, had informed Harry that Floy had been granted leave right when a lake had been discovered near the mouth of one of the entrances, and he would be leaving at the beginning of its extraction. "There will always be events in our lives to bring us great joy," she admonished, lightly, tapping his shoulder to remind him that laying across the table of books and papers was probably not a preferred response to his study time. "But it is our responsibility to be able to grow reticent with age." Arwen looked down to the young boy who had entered their lives a little more than 10 years prior, such a short period of time in their care, and already he had blossomed into this mischievous, playful eveling, elated her with the joy he brought, and also at times brought her to near madness at his schemes. She had never been such a terror, had she? Surely this was a quality only the twins had displayed. Though, her being youngest, she wouldn't have quite recalled them so young. Harry sat up, a pout on his lips but no argument, and she looked at the boy full on. There had been a time when he fit on her hip with ease and would cling to her. Some nights when he would lull to sleep at a fall bonfire or at the Yule festivities that they practiced in full force for his benefit, and she would fondly recall the small hand wound in her hair as he would drool on her shoulder. Now, he would be less manageable to pick up, the past couple years having hit a sudden spurt in his growth, and he stood gangly to her middle, all awkward elbows and knees, the roundness in his cheeks the last of early elfling years. She could still manage it, of course, if he would ever let her. At this point, it became a threat if anything. "I understand, Arwen," he hefted a great sigh, as if she had sentenced him to something far more dire than studies, something to her that there was little other of greater importance. Before snapping large teary eyes at her, "But Floy is certain to arrive today. Tomorrow will be the end of the week. Making tomorrow the more likely that he will arrive, and if it is to be for now, how can you stand to write such poorly penned lettering? Even a dwarf surely will think writing an important craft that needs pursuing." Arwen wasn't quite certain of this fact but didn't give any hint to it. Better to give some sort of ammunition in her field if the boy insisted on being so stubborn. But Harry seemed to think before jolting upright. "I wish to ensure we are properly prepared. The dwarves love to sing tales of their people. I know Saren would love the chance to participate, but we would need proper setting and instruments and all." Saren looked as if she had eaten something particularly rotten, and maybe was wishing she could use her second chance at verbal human tongue to defend herself. Calamoran, Arwen gracefully made her way around the table, seeing one of the young kittens Harry had fallen in love with napping in the sunlight under the table. I suppose at this rate Ada will get involved, and that well. He quickly scrambled off the table at the mention of their father. Elrond, by the stars, was well versed in quarrelsome elven children's ways, and had a knack for reining in bad behavior. Arwen distantly yearned for such a talent, as for she knew they were on the cusp of soon-to-see teen years and at the memory of her brothers going through the same. She inwardly shuddered. I am sorry, Arwen. He fully removed himself from the table, picking up a book recalling the events of the First Age. I am grateful you are here to teach me. I know I must be patient for Floy. I'm trying. It's been more than 10 years. A hand pulled that stone out of his pocket as he fingered the deeply carved ruins, a smile wistfully on his face. And this is a lesson you must learn, Calamoran, she reminded once again. Oh, for the boy and his ability to remember the lessons she attempted to teach. She paused at seeing him finger the rune, eyes glued to the floor distant. Come, Calamoran. How about if we take our books and make our way to the parapet? There, if he does arrive, you will be able to see the sentry coming with the news. Harry blinked, eyes clearing as they brightened, and he smiled. Yes, that works. Thank you, Sissy. And, I only request another hour of your time before I free you, earlier than what was normal, earlier still since he was to be making up for lost time. But Harry was well aware that Arwen was particularly weak when he referred to her as sister in any form. They settled themselves in chairs that met the curve of the balcony, an overlook that wrapped the further side of the library. The sun was not quite midday yet, and was proving rather warm despite it being still early in the season. Arwen gently nudged her seat a little further into the shade of the provided tree, while Harry flopped happily across the other in what would soon be a full sun bath. From there, the hour passed with ease, and Harry actually seemed to lose himself within the text. The boy could be academic if only he allowed himself the chance. Soon the sun rose to midday, and Arwen, fully curled up in the chair now, book propped open on knees as she leaned her cheek on her hand, was surprised the boy hadn't become more antsy with the passing hour and was glad to see him engrossed in battles of the First Age. It was certain that when Ada quizzed him later, he would have much to say. She was about to return her gaze to her book, when noting a commotion in the distance. Harry was on his feet, setting his book on the nearby table while gripping the railing in excitement, leaning over before turning his wide smile to her. The sentry, he breathed before scrambling past her, leaping over Saren, who ducked her head as he did so, looking up to meet eyes with Arwen before rolling them and standing to loyally follow the boy. Arwen lifted the book from the table, smiling while heading back to the library to set it on the desk they had apprehended, nodding to another elf as he tore his gaze from the door. Harry had ran out to Arwen, sharing smiles before returning to his own text. Resolute, she began her way to the front gates, as prepared as she ever could be, to meet the dwarf that held Harry's heart. Please drop by the archive and comment to let the creator know if you enjoyed their work.